In the shadow of Rome's collapse, when the mighty legions vanished and the once great empire crumbled into dust, a new story began to unfold on the mist-covered shores of Britain. This was no tale of peace, it was a story carved in blood, betrayal, and survival. A land torn apart by warring tribes, haunted by the ruins of Roman glory, and forever changed by the arrival of fierce warriors from across the sea. These were the Anglo Saxons, a people who would shape kingdoms, craft epic legends, and lay the very foundation of England itself. For centuries, their world was one of shifting alliances and relentless struggles. Pagan gods clashed with the rise of Christianity, great halls echoed with feasts and whispered conspiracies, and on every horizon loomed the threat of invasion, war, and treachery. Kings rose and fell, saints and warlords battled for power, and through it all, the fate of a nation was forged in fire and shadow. But behind the chronicles of warriors and rulers lies a darker story, one of forgotten bloodlines, mysterious rituals, lost kingdoms swallowed by time, and ancient curses that seemed to haunt their every step. This is not the simple story of England's birth. It is a tale steeped in darkness, filled with secrets that history tried to bury. Welcome to Dark History. If you're ready to walk the misty roads of the Anglo-Saxon world, to uncover the myths, the battles, and the chilling mysteries that defined an age, then stay with us. And before we begin this journey into the forgotten past, make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss the shadows of history as they unfold. Because what you're about to hear is far darker than you ever imagined. Chapter 1. The Fall of Rome and the Dawn of the Anglo-Saxons. When the mighty Roman Empire began to crumble in the early 5th century, few could have imagined how deeply the collapse of its authority would reshape the distant, mist-covered island on the far edge of its dominion, a place the Romans had once called Britannia, a land of rolling green hills, deep forests, and treacherous marshes, where the empire had carved out outposts of civilization with their stone roads, their fortified towns, and their disciplined legions. But where Roman order had always felt tenuous, fragile, as if the land itself resisted being tamed, and now, as Rome's armies withdrew, pulled back to defend the Eternal City from invasions by barbarian hordes, Britannia was left exposed, abandoned, and vulnerable. Its people, Celts, and scattered remnants of imperial settlers suddenly thrust into a new and terrifying reality, where the protections of empire vanished overnight, and the long shadow of chaos fell across their lives, their villages, and their fragile sense of security. Imagine the fear of the local Britons when the last Roman governors sailed away, when the final legionary boots disappeared from the great roads that once connected Londinium, Eboracum, and Verulamium. Suddenly there was no imperial tax collector, no Roman magistrate, no governor to appeal to, only the harsh reality that the island's defenses now depended on its own fractured communities. And in the vacuum of power, new threats emerged: raiders from across the sea, opportunists from the north, and desperate warlords within Britannia itself, all competing for dominance. The Picts surged southward from the highlands of Scotland, fierce warriors slipping past crumbling Roman walls and fortresses, descending into the heart of Britain to raid, burn, and plunder. From across the Irish Sea, the Scoti tribes sent their swift ships, launching devastating attacks on western settlements, carrying off loot and slaves. And from across the North Sea, where the cold, gray waves touched the coasts of what we now call Denmark, northern Germany, and the Netherlands, came a new force, a people hardened by a life of seafaring and tribal warfare, tall, blonde-haired, long-bearded warriors whose very names would soon terrify the Britons, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. These were not the disciplined soldiers of Rome, with their gleaming armor and rigid formations, but ferocious clansmen who fought with long spears, broad shields, and heavy axes, bound together by kinship, driven by hunger, ambition, and a restless spirit that pushed them across the sea in search of new lands to conquer and settle. To the desperate Romano-Britons, beset by constant invasion, these newcomers were first seen as mercenaries, hired swords brought in by local kings and chieftains to defend against the northern and western raiders. And at first, it seemed an answer to prayer. Here were tough, battle-hardened warriors willing to fight in exchange for land, cattle, and wealth, and for a time, the alliance held, with Anglo-Saxon warbands fighting under the banners of British leaders to repel Picts and Scoti. Yet soon, as with so many pacts forged in desperation, the mercenaries realized their employers were weak, their lands rich, and their defenses fragile, and the mercenaries ceased to be allies and became invaders, turning their blades on those who had summoned them, claiming for themselves the fertile fields and river valleys of southern and eastern Britain. Thus began a slow but relentless conquest, a tide that would reshape the island forever, the Anglo-Saxon migration. From the wind-swept shores of Jutland and Saxony came families, not just warriors but women and children, bringing their gods, their customs, their language, and their vision of a new homeland. Their ships landed on Britain's eastern coast, and soon whole settlements were rising where Roman villas had crumbled, timber halls replacing stone forums, pagan shrines supplanting Christian churches, and the old order of Roman Britannia gave way to a patchwork of tribal kingdoms ruled by warlords who styled themselves kings. Imagine the shock for the Britons, who only a generation before had lived under the shadow of Rome, now seeing their world overrun by these fierce newcomers who spoke strange tongues, worshipped deities like Woden, Thunor, and Ti, and who sang epic songs of heroism, bloodshed, and fate around the roaring hearths of their mead. This transformation was not immediate, nor was it uncontested. For decades, battles raged across the land, with figures like the semi-legendary British war leader Ambrosius Aurelianus rallying resistance, and with stories emerging of a great hero named Arthur Weathermyth, or Memory, who fought valiantly to hold back the tide of Saxon conquest, winning victories that became immortalized in legend. Victories that gave the Britons a brief reprieve before the inevitable spread of Anglo-Saxon power. The soil of Britain ran red with blood in these years of turmoil. Villages were burned, fields trampled, and thousands driven westward into the mountains of Wales, Cornwall, and beyond. Yet, as the Anglo-Saxons advanced, they were not merely destroyers, but builders, and their settlements took root, expanding from Kent and East Anglia into the Midlands and the Thames Valley, carving out domains that would one day grow into kingdoms. Slowly, the memory of Rome faded, its ruins left as silent reminders of a vanished age, while the rhythm of life shifted toward the customs of the newcomers' communal halls where feasts and councils were held, warrior bands loyal to their lords through bonds of honor and gift-giving, and a worldview steeped in fatalism, where word or fate loomed over all human endeavors. It was a harsh world, a world of survival and violence, but also one where poetry, craftsmanship, and loyalty held immense value. And as the 6th century dawned, Britain had ceased to be Roman in any sense, and had become something new, a land in transition, a battleground where identities clashed, merged, and reshaped. The Anglo-Saxons did not come as a single people with a single leader, but as diverse tribes, often quarreling with each other as much as with the Britons. And from this chaos, new kingdoms began to form: Kent, Sussex, Wessex, Essex, East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria, each ruled by ambitious kings vying for supremacy, each carving their own story into the soil of Britain, each destined to play a role in the centuries-long saga that would culminate in the forging of England. Yet in these early days, nothing was certain, and survival itself was a daily struggle. Famine, disease, and constant warfare meant life was precarious, and at any moment, a raid or a rival could snuff out the fragile gains of a fledgling kingdom. The question that haunted the island was simple. Who would rise to dominate this fractured landscape, and who would fade into obscurity? The Britons clung to their lands in the west, the Anglo Saxons pressed ever further inland, and in the shadows of these struggles lay the seeds of a civilization that would one day give birth to epic poems like Beowulf, to kings like Alfred the Great, and to a nation whose influence would stretch across the globe. But in the 5th and 6th centuries, none of this was certain, only that the old world of Rome was gone, and the new world of the Anglo-Saxons was being born in fire, blood, and unyielding determination. And as the smoke of burning villages rose into the gray skies of Britain, the people whispered of what was to come, of heroes yet unborn, of betrayals yet to unfold, and of a destiny that no one could foresee. For in this twilight between empires, Britain stood on the knife's edge of history, waiting to see whether it would descend into endless darkness or rise again under the banner of new kings whose names were not yet known. Chapter 2. The First Kingdom's Rise from the Ashes. The collapse of Roman rule had left Britain fractured, a broken land divided between desperate Romano-Britons clinging to the remnants of a lost empire and the encroaching tide of Anglo-Saxon tribes who had begun to carve their new destiny into the island's soil. By the early 6th century, the faint echo of Roman order had been all but drowned out by the clash of swords, the crackle of burning villages, and the roar of warlords proclaiming themselves kings. The Anglo-Saxons were no longer just raiders or mercenaries. They were settlers, colonizers, builders of new domains, and with each passing season, their hold on the land deepened. They came first in scattered warbands, but soon they brought families, livestock, and entire communities across the North Sea, until the very fabric of Britain began to change, not just in who ruled, but in the language spoken, the gods worshipped, the songs sung around the hearth fires, and the laws that governed daily life. It was in this crucible of violence and ambition that the first Anglo-Saxon kingdoms emerged, fragile at first, yet destined to become the pillars of early English history. One of the earliest and most influential of these was Kent, settled largely by the Jutes, who crossed the sea from the region of modern Denmark. According to tradition, the kingdom's founding was tied to the legendary brothers Hengist and Horsa, mercenary leaders brought to Britain by the British ruler Vortigern to defend against Pictish incursions. The story tells how, once their strength was revealed, they seized the land for themselves, establishing a dynasty that would shape the southeast of the island. Whether these tales are truth, myth, or some blend of both, Kent soon grew into a formidable kingdom, strategically placed along the English Channel, open to both trade and invasion. From the shores of Kent, the Anglo-Saxon presence expanded westward and northward, pushing deeper into British territory to the south. Sussex, the land of the South Saxons, was born, its people forging their settlements among the downs and coastlands, while to the West Saxons of Wessex began their rise. Farther north, the Angles spread across East Anglia and into the fertile lands that would one day become Mercia and Northumbria, establishing villages that grew into centers of power. Each kingdom was little more than a cluster of tribal lands bound together under the strongest warrior of the time. Yet each proclaimed itself a realm, and each king sought to expand his influence by sword, oath, or marriage. The Romano-Britons resisted fiercely, retreating into the mountains of Wales and Cornwall, where their culture survived. But on the lowlands and plains, the Anglo-Saxon tide proved unstoppable. Still, resistance produced legends. It is here that we must speak of Arthur, the mysterious war leader who, whether man or myth, stood as a symbol of defiance. Chroniclers would later speak of his victories against the Saxons, battles that bought the Britons precious time, holding back the flood long enough for memories of Rome to linger. But Arthur's victories, if they were real, could not turn the tide forever. Gradually, inexorably, The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms pushed forward, taking more land, enslaving or driving out Britons, and building their halls where Roman villas once stood. Life in these first kingdoms was harsh, yet it carried a sense of rebirth. Gone were the sprawling Roman cities with their stone forums and bustling markets. In their place rose wooden halls, long houses where the lord sat enthroned among his warriors, a golden cup in hand, distributing mead and gifts to bind his followers' loyalty. These halls were more than mere dwellings. They were the beating heart of Anglo-Saxon society, places of feasting, council, and poetry. Around the hearth fire shops, or poets, sang of heroes and ancestors, weaving tales that preserved memory and shaped identity. Such songs bound the people together, reminding them that, though they were new to Britain, they carried with them the weight of tradition and the will of their gods. Religion itself was a defining feature of this age. The Anglo-Saxons worshipped a pantheon of deities: Woden, the Allfather, god of wisdom and war; Thunder, the thunder god, protector with his hammer; Ti, the god of justice and oaths; and Frigg, goddess of love and fertility. Sacred groves and open-air altars dotted the countryside, places where sacrifices were made to ensure victory in battle or prosperity in harvest. To the Christian Britons, who still clung to the faith Rome had brought, these practices seemed barbaric, yet to the newcomers, they were essential, woven into every aspect of life. The conflict between these beliefs would simmer for generations, until missionaries from Rome and Ireland began the long work of converting the Anglo-Saxons. But in these early centuries, the old gods reigned supreme. The political landscape was fragmented. Each kingdom sought dominance, but alliances shifted as quickly as the winds. Kinship ties mattered, but ambition often overrode blood. Kings raided their neighbors for cattle, slaves, or tribute. Vengeance cycles spiraled into endless feuds. And yet, out of this chaos, law began to emerge. Early codes of justice, like those attributed to King Ethelbert of Kent, set penalties for crimes, laying the foundations of English law. Wergold, or manprice, became a cornerstone of justice, assigning value to every life and injury, ensuring that blood feuds might be settled with payment rather than endless cycles of revenge. These laws reflected a society striving for order in a world still dominated by violence. The landscape of Britain was transforming. The great Roman roads still cut across the countryside, though many had fallen into disrepair. Roman walls and towns still stood in ruin, haunted reminders of a vanished empire. But around these ruins, the Anglo-Saxons raised their wooden halls, tilled the soil, and gave their settlements names that still survive today, villages ending in ham, tun, and berry. Their language, Old English, spread quickly, blending with remnants of Latin and Celtic tongues, shaping a speech that would one day evolve into modern English. Each word, each name carried the weight of identity, marking the land as theirs. To the Romano-Brit, watching from the hills and western strongholds, this transformation was a tragedy, the erasure of their way of life, the loss of their fields and families, the decline of their culture. Yet even as they resisted, their influence lingered, absorbed in part by the newcomers. Legends, place names, even fragments of law and story intertwined, creating a tapestry that was neither wholly Anglo-Saxon nor wholly British, but something new, something born of conquest and survival. And through it all, the kingdoms grew stronger. By the end of the 6th century, Kent had established itself as a leader, its King Ethelbert commanding respect even among rival rulers. East Anglia prospered with its fertile fields, Sussex and Wessex expanded steadily, and Northumbria began its rise in the north, destined to one day dominate all others. But as these kingdoms solidified, so too did rivalries, and the island became a patchwork of competing powers, each seeking hegemony, each testing the other on the battlefield. The age of petty warlords was giving way to something larger. The age of kingdoms. It is easy to think of this as inevitable, but nothing in this world was certain. Famine struck with merciless regularity. Plagues swept through villages, decimating populations. Storms destroyed harvests and ships alike. And always, there was the looming threat of violence, whether from rival Saxon kings, lingering British warbands, or raiders from across the sea. In such a world, the strong survived, and the weak vanished from memory. This harsh reality forged the Anglo Saxons into a people hardened by struggle, resilient, and unyielding. Yet the seeds of future greatness were already being sown. As kingdoms grew, they began to develop systems of governance, military organization, and cultural life that would one day blossom into a shared identity. The roots of England, fragile and tentative, were pushing deeper into the soil. The great question was not whether the Anglo-Saxons would endure. They had already proven their strength, but which kingdom would rise supreme, and how long the Britons could resist before being absorbed or forgotten. As the 6th century drew to a close, the island stood on the brink of transformation. Pagan kings ruled from timber halls. Warriors swore oaths of loyalty sealed with rings of gold. Poets sang of heroes and monsters, and ordinary folk struggled simply to survive. Yet, beyond the battles and feuds, beyond the sacrifices to Woden and Thunder, beyond the ruin of Rome and the fading of Celtic power, there was a sense that something vast was unfolding, a destiny that no one could yet name. For in these first kingdoms, in the struggles of Kent, Sussex, Wessex, and East Anglia, the story of England was beginning to take shape, a story that would echo across centuries. But peace, if it ever truly existed, was fleeting. For even as these kingdoms found their footing, new storms were gathering on the horizon, storms that would test their strength, challenge their gods, and force them to decide whether to cling to their old ways or embrace something new. And in the mists of Britain, where the ruins of Rome stood silent, where the songs of bards told of past glories and future hopes, the people whispered of change to come, change that might elevate some kingdoms to glory while plunging others into ruin. The island's fate hung in the balance, and the struggle was only just beginning. Chapter 3: Clash of Faiths, the Coming of Christianity. Dawn of the 7th century brought with it not only the rise of powerful Anglo-Saxon kings, but also the arrival of a force that would forever reshape their world: the Christian faith. For generations, the Anglo-Saxons had bowed to the gods of their ancestors, raising spears to Thunder, offering oaths in the name of Tea, whispering prayers to Woden, and leaving sacrifices at sacred groves beneath the moonlit sky. Their halls echoed with tales of fate, word, and the afterlife in the otherworldly halls of their gods. To them, the old religion was not mere ritual, but the fabric of life itself, tied to every harvest, every battle, and every bond of loyalty. Yet across the sea, in Rome and Ireland, missionaries were preparing to carry with them a new creed, one that promised salvation, eternal life, and a God who demanded faith above the sword. The collision of these worlds would ignite a transformation more profound than conquest. For this was not simply the arrival of a new religion, it was the beginning of a cultural revolution. At the forefront of this transformation stood Ethelbert of Kent, one of the first great kings of the Anglo-Saxon age. By the early 600s, Ethelbert had extended his power beyond Kent, commanding respect from rival kingdoms and forging alliances that gave him the air of a Bretwalda, or overlord. His position was strengthened further when he married Bertha, a Frankish princess from Gaul, who brought with her not only royal prestige, but also her Christian faith. Though Ethelbert himself remained devoted to the gods of his people, he allowed his queen to worship freely, and within the royal halls of Canterbury, a small Christian chapel was established. It was a quiet beginning, a flickering flame in the midst of pagan darkness. The true spark came in 597, when Augustine, a Roman monk sent by Pope Gregory the Great, landed on the shores of Kent with a band of missionaries. Their mission was daring and dangerous, to convert the Anglo Saxon kingdoms to Christianity, beginning with the most powerful and accessible Kent. At first, Ethelbert received Augustine with caution. The pagan lords of Britain remembered well the disasters of the past, the fall of Rome, and the betrayal of old allies. To embrace this new faith was no small choice, for it risked angering both the gods of tradition and the warriors who followed them. Yet Augustine was patient and strategic. He did not demand immediate conversion. Instead, he preached with humility, worked miracles of healing, and displayed the dignity of his faith. Slowly, Ethelbert listened, and slowly, his heart began to turn. The decisive moment came when Ethelbert himself embraced Christianity. He was baptized, and with his conversion, the balance of power shifted across the island. For if the King of Kent, overlord of many, had embraced the God of Rome, then others would surely follow. Augustine established his seat at Canterbury, founding what would become the spiritual heart of England, and the mission expanded rapidly. Churches were raised, monasteries established, and the new faith began to spread along the roads and rivers of Kent, reaching into neighboring kingdoms. But the path of conversion was never simple. Some kingdoms welcomed the faith quickly, others resisted with fierce determination. In Northumbria, King Edwin would eventually be persuaded by the missionary Paulinus, whose eloquence convinced the king that Christianity offered both divine truth and practical power. Edwin's baptism in 627 marked another turning point, for Northumbria was a land of immense influence, and his conversion carried weight across the island. Yet, even here, doubts lingered. Warriors feared abandoning the gods who had given them victory in battle. Farmers questioned whether crops would grow without the blessings of thunder. The struggle was as much cultural as it was spiritual, a battle fought in the hearts and minds of every village and hall. In some places, resistance turned violent. Pagan lords rallied against the encroaching faith, seeing it as a threat to their traditions and authority. Temples were burned, not only by zealous converts, but also by angry pagans who saw betrayal in their own leaders. Civil strife flared, and for decades, Christianity advanced and retreated in waves, sometimes triumphant, sometimes driven underground. The struggle was especially fierce in Mercia, where the kings clung to the old gods longer than most, resisting conversion until nearly the mid-8th century. Mercia's refusal was not just religious, it was political, a statement of independence against the influence of Kent and Rome. Amid this clash of faiths, the role of missionaries from Ireland and Iona proved equally vital. Unlike the Roman missionaries, the Irish monks practiced a harsher, more ascetic Christianity, marked by long fasts, pilgrimages, and fierce devotion. Figures like Aidan of Lindisfarne carried the gospel to the northern kingdoms, blending their Celtic traditions with Anglo Saxon culture. Their monasteries became centers of learning and holiness, where manuscripts were copied, hymns composed, and faith nurtured. The island of Lindisfarne itself would become sacred ground, known as the Holy Island, a beacon of Christianity in the north. The confrontation between Roman and Celtic Christianity eventually came to a head at the Synod of Whitby in 664, where King Oswy of Northumbria was forced to choose between the two traditions. The debate was fierce, touching on issues of calculation of Easter, the shape of the tonsure, and the authority of Rome. In the end, Oswy sided with Rome, uniting Northumbria with the wider Christian world and ensuring that the faith of Augustine, tied to the Pope, would prevail. This decision marked a pivotal moment in the shaping of English Christianity, binding the island not just to the new faith, but to the authority of Rome itself. The cultural transformation was staggering. Monasteries flourished as centers of knowledge, preserving Latin texts and creating some of the earliest works in Old English. The great epic Beowulf, though pagan in setting, was preserved by Christian scribes who infused it with echoes of the new faith. Kings began to see themselves not only as warriors but as Christian rulers, responsible to God for justice and mercy. Law codes incorporated Christian ideals. World was tempered by the concept of sin and penance, and the cross began to replace the hammer of thunder as the symbol of hope and protection. For ordinary people, the change was both subtle and profound. Pagan rituals were slowly replaced by Christian feasts. Sacred groves were converted into churchyards, and the cycle of the year became tied to Christian festivals. Yet in many places, old traditions lingered, woven into the fabric of daily life. The Anglo Saxons did not abandon their past entirely. They adapted, blending old beliefs with new, creating a uniquely Anglo-Saxon Christianity that carried echoes of their pagan heritage. Even today, the days of the week, Wednesday for Woden, Thursday for Thor, Friday for Friggermain, as living reminders of the gods they once worshipped. But beneath this triumph of faith, shadows lingered. For while Christianity promised peace and salvation, it also brought new conflicts. Kingdoms now warred not only for land but for faith. Rivals invoked God to justify their conquests, and missionaries sometimes clashed with pagan lords in struggles as bloody as any battle for territory. And on the horizon loomed new dangers, raiders from across the sea, whose arrival would once again plunge the Christian Anglo-Saxons into chaos. The clash of faiths had reshaped their world, but the true test of their survival was yet to come. The conversion of the Anglo-Saxons was not a single event, but a long, winding journey, filled with victories and setbacks. Heroes and martyrs, kings and missionaries. It was a story of cultural fusion, of an old world meeting a new, and from their union, a civilization was born that would one day call itself England. In the timber halls of Kent, the stone churches of Northumbria, the monasteries of Mercia, and the villages of Wessex, the seeds of that future were being planted, watered by both blood and faith. The gods of old had not vanished completely, but their voices grew fainter with each passing generation, until the cross stood unchallenged as the symbol of the land. Yet the memory of those gods lingered, haunting the stories and the language, whispering through the mists of time. The Anglo-Saxons had entered a new age, and though they could not yet know it, their embrace of Christianity would both strengthen them and set them on a path toward trials more devastating than any they had yet faced. Chapter 4: Shadows from the Sea. The Viking Invasions. The peace that Christianity had brought to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was fragile. A thin veneer stretched across a land that was still fractured by rivalries, blood feuds, and old enmities, and it would not take long for the storms of fate to strike once more. This time, the threat did not come from within, but from the distant, icy fjords of the north, where the sea was both cradle and curse, giving life to hardy seafarers who would soon descend upon England with fire and steel, and their name would become a word of terror whispered in halls and churches alike: the Vikings. The Anglo-Saxons first glimpsed this shadow in 793 when the monastery of Lindisfarne, the Holy Island, that had been a beacon of Christianity in the north, was assaulted without mercy, its monks slaughtered, its treasures seized, its sanctuaries defiled. To the people of the time, this was not merely an attack but an act of sacrilege, a sign that God's wrath had fallen upon them, for who else but demons could strike at the heart of holiness itself? The raid sent shockwaves across all of Christendom, and as word spread, the image of the Viking was carved into memory: tall men clad in iron, wielding axes that split shields and skulls alike, their dragon-proud ships gliding silently over the waves before unleashing death on the unprepared. Yet Lindisfarne was only the beginning, the first drop in what would become a storm that engulfed Anglo-Saxon England for generations. The raiders returned year after year, striking monasteries, coastal villages, and river towns, for the Anglo-Saxon world was rich and unprotected. Its treasures of silver, gold, manuscripts, and cattle were easy plunder, and its scattered kingdoms could not unite quickly enough to resist. Monasteries, once centers of peace and learning, became prime targets. Their bells falling silent under the weight of fire, their holy relics cast aside as trophies. The Anglo Saxons saw in these attacks a test of their faith. For how could the new Christian God allow his people to be scourged by pagans who still bowed to Odin, Thor, and Freya? But the Vikings were no passing plague. They were a relentless tide, and soon they came not only to raid but to conquer. By the mid-9th century, a new force emerged, the Great Heathen Army, a coalition of Norse warriors who did not intend to return to their homelands, but sought to carve out kingdoms for themselves on English soil. In 865 AD they landed in East Anglia, demanding tribute and striking fear into the hearts of the Anglo-Saxon rulers. Led by legendary figures such as Ivar, the Boneless, Ubba, and Halfdan Ragnarsson, the army swept across the land, capturing York in 867 and turning it into their capital of Jrvk, a Viking stronghold in the north. For the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, this was a nightmare come to life. East Anglia was subdued, Northumbria fell into chaos, and Mercia, once powerful, was humbled and forced into uneasy submission. Yet not all would fall. In Wessex, a young king named Alfred, later known as the Great, rose to meet the Viking threat with a combination of courage, cunning, and faith. Alfred's reign was marked by relentless struggle, victories and defeats, retreats into marshes, desperate guerrilla warfare, and moments when Wessex itself seemed on the brink of annihilation. But Alfred was not merely a warrior. He was a strategist, a builder of fortresses, a reformer of armies, and above all, a man of vision who believed that the Anglo-Saxons could endure if they embraced unity. His triumph at the Battle of Edington in 800, where he defeated Guthrum and forced the Vikings into baptism and a treaty, was a turning point, for it created the dividing England between Viking-ruled lands in the north and east, and Anglo-Saxon-controlled Wessex in the south and west. Though this compromise acknowledged Viking power, it also ensured that the Anglo-Saxon heartland survived, giving hope that their culture and faith would not be extinguished. Life under the Vikings was harsh, yet it was not merely destruction, for the Norse brought with them trade, new customs, and settlements that slowly integrated with the Anglo-Saxon world. Towns like York flourished as centers of commerce, where traders from Scandinavia, Ireland, and even the Far East brought goods of every kind: silver from Arabia, silk from Byzantium, furs from the Baltic, and slaves captured from raids across the Isles. This mingling of cultures left its mark on language, law, and society. Many words in modern English sky, window, law, egg trace their roots to the tongues of these Norse invaders. Intermarriage between Saxon and Dane became common, blurring the lines of identity, and though wars raged, so too did exchanges of culture that enriched the fabric of England. Still, the Viking shadow remained ever threatening. Successive waves of raids continued into the 10th century, and though Alfred's successors, such as Edward the Elder and Athelred, extended Wessex's control and even briefly united England under one crown, the fear of the sea raiders never fully left. In 991, at the Battle of Maldon, the Anglo-Saxons once again faced defeat, immortalized in poetry that lamented both the courage and the tragic fall of their warriors. Kings were forced to pay Danegeld tribute in silver to buy peace, a desperate measure that only encouraged further raids. England's wealth was both its blessing and its curse. Drawing the Norsemen back again and again, the Viking invasions tested not only the military strength of the Anglo-Saxons, but also their spirit. Christianity was challenged by the presence of pagan settlers, yet in time, even the Norse would be baptized, their children raised in the new faith, their gods fading as Woden and Thunder had faded before. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles, written by monks, cast the struggle in terms of divine judgment. The sins of kings and people had brought God's wrath, and only through repentance and steadfastness could they hope for deliverance. Yet in truth, the struggle was as much about survival as salvation, about whether the Anglo-Saxon identity could withstand the storm. In the end, the Viking Age reshaped England forever. It forged kings like Alfred into legends, carved new towns from the ashes of old, and bound the scattered kingdoms closer together in the face of shared danger. But it also left scars, villages razed, monasteries abandoned, families broken, and a lingering fear of sails on the horizon. The Anglo-Saxon world had endured, but it had been transformed, hardened by fire, and more aware than ever that survival was never guaranteed. And yet, even as the Viking threat seemed to recede with the baptism of Guthrum and the treaties of Alfred's heirs, darker storms gathered on the horizon, for the Northmen were not the only threat to Anglo-Saxon England. In the centuries to come, betrayal would rise not from across the sea, but from within, as rival kings fought one another, and new invaders, this time not Norse raiders, but Norman conquerors, would cast their gaze upon the island. For the Anglo-Saxons, the age of Vikings was both a crucible and a warning, a reminder that history never rested, that every victory was but a pause before the next great struggle. The sea had brought terror once, and it would again, but from different shores and under different banners. The story of England was still far from finished, and the greatest trials were yet to come. Chapter 5. Alfred's Legacy. The dream of a united England. The defeat of the Vikings at Edington and the baptism of Guthrum was not the end, but the beginning of a new struggle. For King Alfred the Great understood that peace bought with treaties was fragile, like a shield cracked in battle, useful for a time, but destined to fail under the weight of future blows. And so he set about not merely to defend his kingdom of Wessex, but to shape a vision that would outlast him. A vision of an England no longer fractured into squabbling petty realms, but bound together in common cause against all who threatened its shores. Yet the road to that dream was long, fraught with setbacks, betrayals, and the constant menace of Viking return, and it required more than sword and shield. It required the building of a nation's soul. Alfred, though often remembered for his victory at Edington, was as much a builder and thinker as he was a warrior. He reorganized the Fyrd, the citizen army of the Anglo-Saxons, into a more reliable system, where men served in rotation so that the land was never left undefended. He ordered the construction of burhs, fortified towns strategically placed across Wessex, linked by roads and garrisons, so that no Viking force could move freely without facing swift resistance. And in doing so, he created the backbone of England's future urban life. For many of these burhs would grow into the great cities of later centuries. He also turned his mind to learning, believing that the decay of wisdom was as dangerous as the swords of pagans. And so, he championed the translation of holy texts into Old English, brought scholars to his court, and sought to educate both clergy and laymen. For in his eyes, a kingdom ignorant was a kingdom vulnerable. Yet Alfred was no mere dreamer. He was a man shaped by fire, hardened by years in the marshes, where he had hidden while the Vikings overran his land, and he knew that survival required discipline, unity, and faith, and so he cultivated all three, leaving to his children not merely a crown, but a blueprint for endurance. When Alfred died in 899, Wessex mourned him as a father, and his son Edward the Elder inherited both his throne and his unfinished mission. Edward, unlike his father, would not be known for singular legendary moments, but for steady, relentless expansion, for under his reign Wessex pressed outward, fortifying new lands, reclaiming lost territories, and extending influence over Mercia, which had long been humbled by Viking and Dane alike. Indeed, it was Edward's sister, the formidable Thelfold, Lady of the Mercians, who became one of the most remarkable figures of the age, ruling Mercia after her husband's death, leading armies, building fortresses, and striking fear into Viking warlords who underestimated the resolve of a woman commander. and together Edward and Telfeld formed a partnership of blood and steel that began to knit the English kingdoms together. By the time of Ethelflaed's death in 918, and Edward's shortly after in 924, the dream of Alfred had moved closer to reality, for Wessex and Mercia stood united, and the Viking Danelaw, though still strong, was hemmed in, pressured, and slowly crumbling. It was Edward's son who would push the dream to its greatest height, for in him the qualities of Alfred vision, discipline, and faith burned bright. Crowned in 924, Athelstan expanded Wessex's power into Northumbria, subduing York and breaking Viking hold on the north, and through conquest, diplomacy, and marriage alliances he extended his influence across the British Isles, compelling submission from Welsh princes, forging ties with rulers of Scotland, and even earning recognition from continental kings who saw him as one of Europe's great monarchs. In 937 AD, at the Battle of Brunanburh, Athelstan faced the might of a coalition of Scots, Norse, and Irish kings who sought to break his growing dominance, and the clash that followed was so fierce that poets immortalized it in verse, hailing it as the moment when England itself was forged in blood. Athelstan triumphed, and for the first time in history, the land could truly be called one kingdom, England, the land of the Angles. Yet unity was fragile, and even Athelstan's triumph did not end the cycle of raids, rebellions, and rival claims, for the north remained restless, the Vikings always eager to reclaim their hold, and rival lords within England never ceased to scheme. Still, the age of Alfred's heirs marked a transformation. Where once the Anglo Saxons had been scattered, peoples clinging to survival, now they were a nation with a shared identity, a Christian kingdom that saw itself as chosen to endure, a beacon of order against the chaos of the pagan world. Their kings were no longer mere war leaders, but lawgivers, builders of churches, patrons of learning, and symbols of continuity in an uncertain age. The burghs of Alfred expanded into bustling centers of trade, drawing merchants from distant lands, while the fusion of Saxon and Norse culture enriched language, art, and law, creating a society that was both resilient and adaptive. Yet shadows lingered. The Danegeld, the dreaded tribute, still haunted the treasury. Viking fleets still prowled the seas, and the constant strain of war left fields untended, families broken, and monasteries ever wary of fire from the horizon. The Anglo Saxons had learned to endure. But endurance was not peace, it was survival on the edge of a blade. The dream of unity was fragile because it was new, held together by the strength of extraordinary kings and queens, whose will imposed order on a land still marked by tribal loyalties and ancient feuds. And as history would prove, when such strength faltered, the unity could fracture. The legacy of Alfred and his heirs was monumental, but it was also precarious. For the very kingdom they built would become the prize for future invaders, coveted not only by the sons of Odin, but by ambitious lords across the Channel, who saw in England a realm ripe for conquest. For now, the Anglo-Saxons stood tall, their banners flying over a land more united than ever before. But in the whispers of monasteries and the sagas of the North, there were already hints that greater storms were gathering. Storms that would test not just kings, but the very survival of the Anglo-Saxon world itself. Chapter 6. The Return of the Northmen. The Shadow of the Danelaw. Though the vision of Alfred and the triumphs of his heirs had drawn the many shires and kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxons closer than ever before, the unity of England was not yet secure, for the sea never sleeps, and from the mists of the northern horizon the dragon-proud ships of the Vikings still glided forth, their sails red with dawn, their warriors hungering for plunder, conquest, and dominion. And so, even as King Athelstan had bound the land together through blood and victory, the death of that mighty ruler in 939 opened a door through which old enemies rushed with renewed fury. Northumbria, always restless under southern rule, seized upon the moment to invite Viking leaders back into power, and the kings of Dublin, themselves Norsemen, ruling Ireland, sailed eastward to claim York, that great northern city which had so often been the heart of the Danelaw. The Anglo-Saxon crown, now in the hands of Edmund, Athelstan's half-brother, found itself beset on all sides, forced to defend what had so recently been won. The cycle of conquest and resistance resumed, and though Edmund and his successors, like Edred and Edgar, fought with relentless determination, the truth was grim. The Danelaw, thought to have been crushed, flared back to life like embers in ash, burning once more with the promise of Norse dominion. The Anglo-Saxons, for all their progress, discovered that unity was a fragile flower that could wither in the frost of invasion. And in those years of turmoil, England teetered on the edge of fracture. Yet if the Vikings returned with fire, they also came with something subtler, for their generations of settlement had left lasting roots in the soil of England. Norse families had farmed English fields, traded in English markets, intermarried with English kin, and woven themselves into the very fabric of daily life. And so the line between invader and neighbor blurred, creating not only conflict, but also a hybrid culture where laws, words, and traditions blended. This duality defined the era. The sword of the Dane was feared. Yet the tongue of the Dane shaped the very language of England, giving new life to Old English, forging the beginnings of the words that would one day become modern English. In law, too, the codes of Alfred and the customs of the Norse merged, producing a legal tradition that valued both written statutes and oral bargains. But the raids and wars did not relent. Under King Edgar, called the Peaceful, England reached a height of relative stability, its navy patrolling the seas, its monasteries flourishing with learning and prayer. Yet even in that golden hour, the Vikings were never far, and within a generation their fury returned with greater ferocity than ever before. It was under King T, later remembered bitterly as Telerd the Unready, that the storm broke in full, beginning in the 980s. Vast fleets of Vikings swept across the English coasts. Not small raiding parties as in earlier times, but great armies once more, eager to reclaim the riches of a land now known for its unity and wealth. Towns burned, churches were sacked, and the king, uncertain, hesitant, and ill-advised, struggled to resist. Instead of facing the invaders with Alfred's steel and fire, Telerd turned again and again to the Denegat, the dreaded tribute of silver paid to buy peace. But each payment only sharpened the hunger of the raiders, who returned in greater numbers, demanding more gold, more land, more submission. The people of England, once hardened under Alfred and his heirs, now despaired, for they saw their king not as a shield but as a burden, a man who could not command the loyalty of his nobles nor inspire the courage of his Fyrd. In 1002, the Telerd, driven by fear and mistrust, ordered the St. Brice's Day massacre, a brutal attempt to slaughter the Danes living in England, men, women, and children alike, an act of desperation that stained the land with innocent blood, and, far from breaking the Viking threat, ignited a firestorm of vengeance. For among the slain were kin of powerful lords, even kin of the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard, who swore to avenge the slaughter. Within a few years, the fleets of Denmark descended with fury, no longer mere raiders, but kings bent on conquest. And Telerd fled, abandoned by his lords, taking refuge in Normandy across the sea, while Sweyn seized the throne of England. Though Sweyn died suddenly in 1014, his son Canute the Great returned to claim his father's prize, and after years of bloody struggle, he succeeded, forging a North Sea empire that stretched from Denmark to England and even into Norway, binding together lands, once divided by sea, into a single realm of Viking power. For the first time in history, England was ruled not by an Anglo-Saxon king, but by a Dane, and though many feared the end of Alfred's dream, What followed was not merely conquest, but transformation, for unlike many of his raiding forebears, proved himself not only a conqueror, but a statesman. He respected the church, upheld the laws of the English, married Elthered's widow, Emma of Normandy, to cement legitimacy, and ruled with a balance of firmness and piety that won him loyalty from both Dane and Saxon. Under his reign, England was drawn into the heart of European politics, no longer a kingdom besieged, but a linchpin in a vast northern empire. Yet unity under Canute was built on his strength alone, and when he died in 1035, the empire fractured, torn apart by rival sons and competing claims, and England, once more, became a prize for ambition. The Anglo-Saxon line, long thought extinguished, flickered back to life in Edward the Confessor, son of Tellard, who returned from exile to claim the throne in 1042. His reign, marked by piety and the building of Westminster Abbey, brought peace for a time, but his lack of an heir sowed seeds of disaster. For when he died in 1066, England was left vulnerable to the greatest challenge it had ever faced. Not the Vikings of the north, but the Normans of the south, themselves descendants of Vikings who had long since settled in France. And so the saga of the Anglo Saxons, defined for centuries by their struggle with the Norse, entered its final act. The Danelaw had risen and fallen, the Danes had ruled and then departed, and the English had endured, stronger yet scarred. Their culture enriched by the mingling of Saxon and Norse, their spirit tempered by generations of fire. But fate was not yet finished with them, for across the Channel, a duke named William sharpened his sword and laid claim to the throne, and with him came the storm that would end the age of the Anglo-Saxons forever. Chapter 7 to 1066. The year of 3 battles. The year was 1066, and never before had the fate of England hung by such a fragile thread, for in that single year 3 kings would claim the crown, 3 armies would clash upon its soil, and the destiny of the Anglo-Saxon people, centuries in the making, would be decided in blood, when Edward the Confessor, last son of Tellard, breathed his final breath on a cold January night. He left behind no heir, no child to carry his line, and in that void of succession ambition flared like fire in dry grass. In Wessex, the powerful Earl Harold Godwinson, brother-in-law to the dead king and the mightiest noble in the land, seized the throne, crowned swiftly at Westminster, his hand upon the sacred relics, his brow pressed by the archbishop's crown, and in that moment Harold became king not by the quiet inheritance of blood but by the daring claim of power. Yet, even as the bells rang, far beyond the Channel and the North Sea, others stirred who saw the throne as theirs by right. Across the sea in Normandy, Duke William, kinsman of Edward through Norman blood, proclaimed that Harold had sworn him the crown years before, swearing upon holy relics to uphold William's claim. And thus, when Edward died, William saw betrayal, an oath broken, and he raised his banners to invade, in the north, across the fjords of Norway. King Harald Hardrada, last great Viking of his age, hardened by years of battle from Byzantium to the Baltic, declared that an ancient agreement bound England to Norway's crown, and with fierce resolve he too set sail. 3 men, 3 claims, and 1 throne England would burn before it bent, and the Anglo-Saxons would fight for their very survival. Harold Godwinson, though crowned in haste, was no weakling, for he was a seasoned warrior, bred in the chaos of raiding and rebellion, son of the powerful Godwin family that had risen to dominate England under Edward's troubled reign. Yet, even with his strength, the challenge was immense. He knew William would come, for the Norman duke was not a man to surrender a claim once made, and William's duchy, disciplined by years of war, was home to some of the fiercest knights of Europe, men armored in chain, mounted on great war horses, trained to fight with lance and sword in deadly precision. But Harold had no time to dwell on Normandy, for before William's sails could catch the Channel winds, word came that Harold Hardrada had landed in the north with a massive fleet, joined by Harold's own treacherous brother, Tostig, once Earl of Northumbria, now turned against his kin in hunger for revenge. The Viking king marched upon York, his banners gleaming with the raven of Odin, and at Fulford his forces crushed the northern English earls, sweeping aside resistance, and the gates of York opened to him. The north seemed lost, and England stood divided, yet Harold Godwinson, swift and relentless, marched his army nearly 200 miles in less than a week, catching the invaders at Stamford Bridge on September 25th. There, in one of the most brutal and legendary battles in English history, the Anglo Saxons shattered the Viking host. Hardrada fell with an arrow to the throat, Tostig lay slain beside him, and the Viking dream of conquering England died in a field soaked red with blood. So fierce was the slaughter that only a handful of the great Norwegian fleet returned across the sea, their ships carrying not treasure but corpses, and the Anglo Saxons rejoiced, believing the worst had passed. But fate is merciless, and even as Harold's warriors wiped the blood of Hardrada's men from their blades, word reached him of a greater storm. William had landed at Pevensey on the southern coast with thousands of Norman knights, archers, and infantry, his banners flying high, his cavalry already ravaging the countryside to lure Harold south. Exhausted from their northern march, Harold's men had no rest. He drove them on, forcing another brutal journey back across England, for he would not allow William to entrench himself, and thus, within 3 weeks, the Anglo-Saxon fyrd faced the Norman host upon the slopes of Senlac Hill near Hastings. The morning of October 14th dawned with ominous skies, the two armies staring across a field that would decide the future of England. Harold's men, mostly infantry armed with axes, spears, and shields, formed a solid shield wall, an unbroken line of wooden shields and iron blades, while William's army advanced with archers, infantry, and most deadly of all, his mounted knights, armored men upon great destriers, trained to charge in devastating waves. The battle raged for hours. Norman arrows darkened the sky but failed to pierce the wall. William's cavalry charged again and again, their horses screaming, their lances shattering against Saxon shields. Yet the line held, the Saxons roaring their defiance, axes cleaving man and beast alike. 3 times the Normans faltered, and rumor spread that William had fallen. But the Duke, unhorsed yet unbroken, lifted his helmet to reveal his face, rallying his men with cries of vengeance, and pressed the fight anew. Then, in a moment of cunning or chance, part of the Saxon line broke forward in pursuit of retreating Normans, and William seized the moment. His cavalry wheeled, cutting down the exposed Saxons, and the shield wall, once unbroken, began to fracture. As the sun dipped low, the battle reached its terrible climax. An arrow, loosed high into the air, struck Harold in the eye or so, the chroniclers say, and the English king fell where he stood, his body hacked apart by Norman blades. Leaderless, the Saxon host collapsed, and the field was left to the conqueror. On Christmas Day of 1066, William, now called the Conqueror, was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey, the same sacred place where Harold had been crowned less than a year before. Yet even as the crown was set upon his head, the sound of shouting and fear outside caused Norman guards to panic, setting fire to nearby houses. Smoke filled the city, and thus William's coronation was marked not by peace but by chaos, a fitting omen for the storm to come. For the conquest did not end at Hastings. Across England, Saxon lords resisted, uprisings flared, and William crushed them with ruthless ferocity, building castles of stone across the land, fortresses of power from which his Norman lords ruled, their towers casting shadows upon a conquered people. The age of the Anglo Saxons, born from the ruins of Rome, forged in centuries of war, with Viking and Dane, had ended in fire and iron. The Norman age had begun, and with it, England was forever changed. The Anglo Saxon dream of a united realm endured, but now, under new masters, their tongue bending under Norman French, their lands divided among foreign knights, their freedoms eroded by feudal bonds. Yet even in defeat, the legacy of the Saxons lived on, for their laws, their culture, their spirit, would merge with that of the conquerors to form something new, England itself, a kingdom forged from Saxon roots and Norman steel, destined to shape the destiny of the world. But for those who stood at Hastings, for those who buried their dead upon the fields of Stamford Bridge and Senlac Hill, the story was not of future greatness, but of loss, the twilight of their people, and the memory of a king who fell with an arrow in his eye while the sun set upon the age of the Anglo Saxons. Chapter 8. The Broken Crown. Anglo-Saxon resistance under Norman rule. The year after Hastings was not peace, but a storm of fire and rebellion. For though William of Normandy had claimed the crown of England with the blood of Harold, Godwinson, and the bodies of thousands lying upon Senlac Hill, the kingdom he had taken was not his in truth, but a realm of defiance, and the Anglo-Saxons, though beaten, were not broken. They were a people forged across centuries of war with Dane and Norse, hardened by invasion and struggle, and they would not surrender their lands, their freedom, or their ancient ways, without a fight. From the very moment William marched from the charred ruins of Hastings toward London, Saxon resistance burned in every shire and village, for the conqueror was a stranger, his language foreign, his knights harsh, his castles symbols of oppression, and the peasants and lords alike saw in him not a king, but a conqueror who ruled by the sword. London itself, though cowed, nearly barred its gates against him, and it was only through a mixture of fear, negotiation, and the exhaustion of Harold's death that the city submitted, allowing William to be crowned on Christmas Day 1066 within Westminster Abbey. But even there, the sounds of Norman shouts and the crackle of flames outside nearly turned his coronation into a massacre. And so the reign of William began, not with harmony, but with smoke and steel, a fitting omen of what was to come. The conqueror understood well that conquest won upon the battlefield must be maintained by terror and strength, and thus he moved swiftly to cement his hold. The Saxon earls who remained were stripped of their power, their lands seized and divided among William's Norman knights, who built fortresses of stone across England, castles that rose like iron teeth from the earth-towering keeps, and wooden Martin-Bailey strongholds that loomed over villages, visible reminders of domination. These castles were not merely homes but weapons, designed to crush rebellion, for, from their battlements, Norman lords could ride forth at will, burning farms, seizing harvests, and enforcing their will upon the conquered. For the Saxons, it was as if a shadow had fallen across their land. Their fields worked for masters who spoke a tongue alien to their ears, their courts governed by laws twisted to favor their oppressors, their churches filled with priests from Normandy, their ancient nobility replaced by foreign lords. Yet, even so, the spirit of resistance flared, and the Anglo-Saxons would not go quietly into chains. The first sparks of rebellion ignited in 1067, scarcely months after William's coronation, when English lords in Kent, Herefordshire, and across the north rose in arms, joined by forces from Denmark and even Scotland, who saw opportunity in England's turmoil. William marched with relentless fury, crushing each uprising with brutal precision, his knights burning villages, his men hanging rebels as traitors. Yet for every revolt suppressed, another flared, and none more fiercely than in the north, where the earls of Northumbria, proud and independent, rejected Norman overlordship. In 1068, rebellion spread through Yorkshire, and the following year it swelled to greater heights when King Sweyn of Denmark landed with a fleet, joined by Saxon lords who sought to cast off Norman rule. Together they seized York, slaughtering Norman garrisons and burning the castles William had built. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the Saxons might reclaim their freedom, that the old blood of the North would drive out the conqueror and restore their ancient crown. But William's wrath was merciless, and his vengeance upon the North would be remembered for centuries as one of the darkest chapters in England's history, the harrying of the North. Through the bitter winter of 1069 to 1070, the Norman army swept across Yorkshire and beyond, burning towns, slaughtering villagers, salting fields, and cutting down all who resisted. Crops were torched, livestock seized or slain, and famine followed in their wake, so devastating that chroniclers claimed a third of the North's people perished. The land lay in ashes, corpses rotted in fields, and for miles the smoke of ruin rose into the sky. The Saxon dream of rebellion in the North was drowned in blood and starvation, and William's iron grip tightened. To those who survived, the conqueror became a figure of dread, a king who ruled not by love, but by fear, his justice, the sword, his mercy, the fire. Yet, even amidst such horror, resistance did not wholly die. For in the wild fens of Ely, a lone figure stood against him, Hereward, the Wake, last hero of the Saxons. Hereward, an outlaw and warrior, gathered men to his banner, resisting Norman garrisons with raids and ambushes, striking from the marshes like a shadow. Legend spread of his cunning, of how he outwitted William's knights, of how he stood as the last free Saxon, and men flocked to him, making Ely a stronghold of rebellion. For years Hereward defied the Normans, and though his cause was doomed, he became a symbol, the embodiment of Saxon defiance, a whisper that even in defeat, the spirit of the old people endured. But William, relentless, eventually crushed Ely too, driving Hereward into exile or death, the truth lost in legend. With that large-scale resistance crumbled, and the Norman yoke pressed fully upon the land. Yet conquest was not merely of the sword. It was of culture, language, and law. The Normans reshaped England, replacing Saxon nobility with Norman lords, seizing nearly every estate of value, so that within 2 decades scarcely an English noble remained. The Domesday Book, William's great survey of the land in 1086, revealed a kingdom transformed, fields, forests, villages, and mills all recorded, not for the Saxon people, but for their Norman masters. The language of power shifted from Old English to Norman French, in the courts, in the castles, in the councils of the realm. The Saxon tongue was silenced, driven back into the fields and villages of common folk. The very architecture of the land changed, as stone churches and castles rose in the Romanesque style, vast and imposing, overshadowing the wooden halls of Saxon tradition. Still, the Saxon legacy did not vanish, for their laws, their customs, their spirit of community persisted beneath the Norman veneer. The shire courts and hundreds survived, their roots deep, their memory long. The English Church, though filled with Norman bishops, still held the memory of its saints and traditions. The people themselves, though beaten, carried their identity in blood and tongue, passing it to their children. Over time, Norman and Saxon would blend, intermarrying, their languages merging to form the beginnings of English as we know it, a hybrid tongue forged from conquest and resilience. But in those early years, in the decades after 1066, the memory of loss, of Harold's fall, of the burning of the North, lingered like a wound. For the Anglo Saxons, the Norman conquest was more than defeat. It was the end of an age. No longer would their kings sit upon the throne. No longer would their lords command their lands. No longer would their tongue rule the courts. They became a conquered people, subjects of foreign masters, their history turned from glory to lament. Yet even in that darkness, they endured, their blood carried forward, their spirit unbroken, and in time their culture would rise again, mingled with that of their conquerors, to forge a new identity, neither wholly Saxon nor wholly Norman, but something born from both. destined to endure. Thus the Anglo-Saxon age ended not in a single battle, but in a long struggle, a slow erosion, a bitter fading of power under Norman steel. And yet, their story lived in chronicles, in song, in memory, reminding all who came after that, even in conquest, even in fire and famine, a people's spirit does not die. For though their crown was broken, their legacy endured, and from the ashes of their fall, a new England began to rise. Chapter 9. The Last Echoes. Saxon Survival in a Norman World. The Norman conquest of 1066 had shattered the Saxon crown and ground the nobility beneath the weight of foreign steel. But conquest does not erase a people in a single blow. And though the warriors, who had followed Harold Godwinson into death at Hastings, lay silent in their graves, though the Earls of Northumbria and Mercia had been stripped of power, though William the Conqueror's men ruled from castles of stone and wood that scarred the landscape, the Anglo-Saxon world did not vanish. It endured in whispers, in fields, in the quiet resilience of peasants, in the stubborn faith of priests, and in the secret pride of families who remembered their fathers and mothers who had once called this land their own. England may have worn a Norman crown, but in its soil, in its blood, in its language, the Saxon heart continued to beat. The struggle of the late 11th century was not the grand rebellion of armies marching to banners, but the slower, quieter resistance of survival. And it was this survival that shaped the destiny of England in ways no conqueror could wholly master. For William and his Norman lords, domination was built upon terror and law. They claimed every field, every mill, every forest, and through the Doomsday Survey they reduced a land of communities and traditions into entries on parchment, marks of ownership where once stood rights and freedoms. Yet even as Norman scribes wrote their Latin and French into these records, the Saxon people lived on beneath the ink. The plowman still drove his oxen across the furrows, singing songs in Old English. The smith still hammered iron in his forge, shaping tools as his forefathers had. The reeve still called together the men of the 100 Court, where disputes were settled according to ancient customs, though now under the watchful eye of a Norman lord. In the churches, the Latin of the Mass mingled with the Saxon hymns whispered by common tongues. The conquerors could seize land, but they could not wholly strip away the identity woven into the daily life of the people. Still, the weight of oppression was real and heavy. Castles rose like scars upon the land, reminders of foreign rule, and garrisons of mailed knights rode out to enforce their will. The Saxon freemen found themselves reduced to tenants, their labor extracted for Norman masters. Forest laws were imposed, making vast stretches of woodland the private hunting preserves of kings and barons, punishing peasants with blinding or mutilation for daring to hunt where once their fathers had gathered deer and boar. The abbeys and monasteries, once bastions of Saxon culture and learning, were filled with Norman abbots, their scriptoria filled with the flowing Latin of continental Europe rather than the bold strokes of Old English chronicles. Even the great monasteries like Canterbury and Winchester became instruments of Norman power. Yet in hidden corners, monks still wrote in the old tongue, preserving memories of the past, and families still passed down tales of Alfred, of Athelstan, of Edmund Ironside, refusing to let the memory of their kings vanish. The story of Saxon survival was one of adaptation, for the people could not drive out their conquerors, yet they could endure and transform. Intermarriage soon followed conquest. Saxon women married Norman lords, Saxon men served in Norman households, and children were born who carried both bloodlines. Language, too, began to shift. At first, French was the tongue of the court, of the law, of the lords, while Old English remained the speech of peasants and priests. But over time, these languages mingled, French words seeping into English, shaping a hybrid tongue that would, in centuries, become the English we know. In markets and villages, one could hear this blending air. Reeve might use a Norman word to describe a tool. A merchant might bargain using both Saxon and French terms. It was not deliberate rebellion, but survival through absorption, the quiet resistance of refusing to vanish, of transforming the conqueror's language into one's own. There were still sparks of defiance. In the wild fens of Ely Hereward, the Wake had fought his guerrilla war. But even after his fall, whispers of his legend carried through England. Ballads told of his tricks, how he fooled Norman knights, how he struck at their garrisons and vanished into the marshes. Mothers told their sons of Hereward by firelight, teaching them that courage and cunning were not forgotten. In the north, the memory of the harrying lingered in bitterness, but also in quiet pride, for though William had burned their lands, the people had endured famine, had rebuilt their villages, had survived the conqueror's wrath. Resistance did not need swords. Sometimes it lived in the simple act of planting seed again after fields had been salted. The church became both a weapon of Norman control and a vessel of Saxon endurance. Bishops like Lanfranc, appointed by William, imposed reforms, tightening the connection to Rome, replacing Saxon traditions with continental practices. Yet the parish priests, often Saxon by birth, continued to preach to their flocks in the old tongue, carrying forward the rhythms of language and the comfort of familiar prayers. The saints of England, Cuthbert, Dunstan, Edmund, remained revered, their shrines still visited by Saxon pilgrims, their stories still told in Saxon speech. The conquerors might control the bishop, but they could not strip the land of its saints. Economically, the Saxons bore the weight of Norman yet their labor built not only the wealth of the conquerors but also the foundations of a New England. Towns grew under Norman rule, markets flourished, trade expanded across the Channel. Saxon merchants adapted quickly, learning the tongues of their new masters, navigating both worlds. In this way, the Saxon spirit bent, but did not break. It endured, reshaped by necessity, but alive. The Doomsday Book itself, often seen as a symbol of oppression, also preserved the memory of a Saxon world. In its pages, the names of villages, of fields, of rivers are recorded, many in their Saxon form. Though compiled for the conqueror's gain, it became a vessel of Saxon identity, a frozen snapshot of a world in transition. A Norman clerk might write Terra Regis for the king's land, but beside it stood Wessex and Norfolk and Hastings, names rooted in Saxon heritage, carved into parchment to endure the centuries. Yet, even as the Saxons survived, a deep wound lingered, the wound of lost freedom, of broken kingship. The dream of an English crown, of rulers born of the land, had ended at Hastings. The kings to come would all bear Norman blood, their courts filled with French, their palaces built in Norman stone. To the Saxon people, kingship became distant, alien. Loyalty shifted instead to local communities, to village, to kin, to parish, where the old bonds still held. The nation was fractured, but within those fractures lay the seeds of something new. For when Norman and Saxon finally blended, the result would be a kingdom unlike either, a fusion destined to shape the medieval world. This survival was not without pain. Justice under Norman lords was often harsh and cruel. The murdrum fine, imposed upon villages where a Norman was slain, forced Saxons to police themselves under threat of collective punishment. Castles, symbols of Norman domination, loomed over fields, their shadows a daily reminder of conquest. Yet life continued. The harvests were planted, marriages celebrated, children born. The world of the Saxon peasantry, though burdened, remained rooted in cycles of life that no conqueror could wholly sever. In this, the truest resistance lay not in rebellion, but in endurance. Legends began to take root, shaping memory. The tales of Harold's last stand, of Hereward's defiance, of the bravery of northern rebels, became part of the Saxon soul, stories told not as history alone but as identity. These legends preserved hope, teaching that though they had lost their crown, they had not lost their worth. And as the decades passed, as the generation who had seen Hastings with their own eyes gave way to children born under Norman kings, the Saxon identity transformed. They were no longer simply conquered. They were survivors, heirs to both defeat and endurance. In the centuries to come, chroniclers would look back and call 1066 the end of Anglo-Saxon England, the close of one age and the dawn of another. But in truth, the age did not end so cleanly. It lingered in the speech of the people, in their fields, in their songs, in their faith. It lingered in resentment, in pride, in the quiet defiance of remembering who they were. The Norman crown might sit upon the throne, but the Saxon heart remained in the land, in the villages, in the memory of all who tilled the soil. And from this endurance, from this survival, a New England would be born, not Saxon, not Norman, but both. A kingdom shaped by conquest, yet enriched by the strength of those who refused to vanish. Thus the last echoes of Saxon England were not cries of despair, but whispers of resilience, carried forward through centuries, shaping a people who would, in time, rise again, forging an identity that no conqueror could erase. For history is not only written by the victors, it is lived by the survivors. Chapter 10. Saxon Blood. Norman Crown, the blending of a kingdom. When the dust of conquest settled, and the Norman kings sat firmly upon the throne of England, it became clear that the story of the Anglo-Saxons had not ended at Hastings, but had entered a new and more complex phase. For though the Saxon nobility had been crushed, though Norman lords held the castles and estates, though French was spoken at court and Latin in the monasteries, the blood of the Saxons still flowed through the veins of the English people, and the land itself remembered their roots, and thus began a slow, often painful, but ultimately transformative blending, a fusion of conqueror and conquered that would give birth to a kingdom unlike any other in Europe, a kingdom that drew from the strength of both traditions, Saxon endurance and Norman ambition, Saxon law and Norman order, Saxon faith and Norman pride. The first generation after the conquest lived in a world of fracture, where Saxon peasants bent beneath Norman lords, where resentment simmered, where old rights were stripped away and foreign customs imposed. But beneath this tension ran a current of inevitability, for conqueror and conquered could not remain forever divided, and in time, through marriage, through trade, through necessity, their worlds began to merge. The most obvious expression of this blending came through blood itself. Norman knights, granted estates across the countryside, found themselves surrounded by Saxon families, whose daughters were the only women of the land. In many cases, these knights took Saxon brides, whether by arrangement, necessity, or desire. From these unions were born children who carried both lineages, heirs who bore Norman names but grew up in villages still speaking Old English, in the households of the great lords. Saxon servants and Norman masters lived side by side, their daily interactions forcing the exchange of words, customs, and habits. Within a generation, children grew who could understand both tongues, who could move between the marketplace where Saxon was spoken and the court where French was demanded. The sharp lines of division began to blur, not erased by policy or law, but softened by the simple realities of life, of marriage, of raising children together in the same land. Language itself became the battlefield and the bridge of this blending. At first, the court and aristocracy clung fiercely to French, for it was the mark of distinction, the language of law, of chivalry, of royal decrees, while Old English remained the tongue of peasants, of priests, of markets. But over time, the two mingled, for no conqueror can live forever as an island apart. And as Norman lords administered their estates, they found it necessary to learn the words of their tenants, while Saxons, eager to survive, began to absorb the speech of their masters. From this contact, the English language as we know it today began to take shape. a remarkable hybrid that preserved the sturdy roots of Saxon grammar while absorbing thousands of Norman words, terms of law, of art, of government, of courtly life. Where once a Saxon might say house, the Norman added mansion. Where once he said kingly, the Norman offered royal. Thus words doubled, blended, shaded into new meanings, enriching the tongue with depth and subtlety. This linguistic fusion was not a planned act of policy but the natural result of peoples living together, of servants speaking to masters, of children growing up between two worlds. By the 12th century, English had become a language distinct from either of its parents, a testament to the resilience of the Saxons and the adaptability of the Normans. Law and governance, too, reflected this blending. The Normans brought with them the feudal system, a rigid hierarchy of obligations that bound vassals to lords, lords to kings, with land granted in exchange for service and loyalty. The Saxons, by contrast, had lived in a world of shires and hundreds of local courts and communal responsibilities. In the first years after conquest, Norman law seemed to crush Saxon traditions, imposing harsh forest laws, demanding new taxes, and instituting feudal obligations. Yet over time, elements of Saxon custom crept back into the system. For the Normans discovered the efficiency of local courts, the practicality of the reeve and the hundred, the deep loyalty Saxons felt toward community justice. Rather than abolish these traditions, the Normans adapted them, weaving Saxon practices into the fabric of feudal governance. The result was a legal system unlike that of France or Germany, a hybrid that valued both royal authority and local custom, a system that laid the foundations for what centuries later would become English common law. In this way, the Saxon spirit lived on, not in defiance, but in the very structures of the realm. Religion provided another arena of blending. The Normans imposed their own abbots and bishops, reshaping monasteries to reflect continental reforms, emphasizing ties to Rome, enforcing clerical celibacy, and building great Romanesque cathedrals of stone. Yet the Saxon devotion to local saints and shrines persisted, for no decree could erase the love of the people for St. Cuthbert of Durham, for St. Edmund the Martyr, for St. Dunstan. Pilgrimages to Saxon shrines continued. Prayers in Old English lingered in the mouths of peasants, and the rhythms of the old liturgies echoed in village churches. The Norman hierarchy may have reshaped the upper church, but the grassroots of Saxon piety endured, and gradually the two intertwined. The magnificent cathedrals built by Normans became the new homes of old saints, their relics enshrined beneath soaring arches. Thus, even in the realm of faith, Saxon and Norman merged, one providing depth of devotion, the other grandeur of architecture, together creating a spiritual culture unique to England. Economics further wove the two peoples together. Norman lords depended on Saxon labor, and Saxon merchants found opportunity in Norman networks that linked England to Normandy, to Flanders, to the wider continent. Markets expanded, towns grew, and with them came a new middle class of mixed heritage. Saxon merchants learning French, Norman craftsmen marrying into Saxon families. Trade brought wealth, and wealth brought new freedoms. As burghers purchased charters granting towns independence from feudal lords. In this way, the blending of Saxon endurance and Norman ambition created a dynamic economy, setting the stage for England's later prosperity. Culturally, the fusion was profound. The heroic traditions of the Saxons, preserved in poems like Beowulf and in tales of kings like Alfred and Edmund, mingled with the chivalric ideals of the Normans, with their songs of Roland and their romances of knights and ladies. Out of this mixture emerged a unique English literature, one that carried the strength of Saxon earthiness and the elegance of Norman refinement. The old hall, where Saxons gathered to hear stories of warriors and feasts, gave way to the castle, where Normans held courtly banquets. But within those halls the tales of both traditions were told, shaping the imagination of a new people. Art, too, reflected this blending, with Saxon craftsmanship in metal and embroidery merging with Norman taste for grandeur, producing treasures such as the Bayeux tapestry, which, though Norman in commission, bore the marks of Saxon hands in its stitching. Over generations, identity itself transformed. The first Saxons who had lived through the conquest had spoken of themselves as a conquered people, bitter and resentful, clinging to the memory of their lost kings. But by the time of William's grandchildren, a new identity was emerging, one that saw itself not as Saxon or Norman but as English. This was not the sudden result of policy, but the slow, organic outcome of daily life, of marriages, of children, of markets, of churches, of laws. The conquerors had been absorbed into the land they had taken, and the conquered had reshaped their conquerors. By the 12th century, a New England existed, neither wholly Saxon nor wholly Norman, but something stronger, forged in fire and survival. Yet the memory of the Saxon past was not lost. Chronicles continued to be written, recording the deeds of Alfred, of Tethelard, of Harold. Legends of Hereward and of Saxon saints were told for centuries, their memory shaping English identity long after the Norman conquest had faded into history. The English kings of later centuries, though Norman in blood, looked back to Alfred and Athelstan as their forebears, claiming continuity with the Saxon line to legitimize their rule. The blending of blood and culture had not erased the past. It had woven it into the present. Thus the Anglo Saxon legacy endured, not in isolation but in fusion. The Saxon people, though conquered, refused to vanish, and in their endurance they reshaped their conquerors. The Normans brought castles, knights, and feudalism. The Saxons brought language, law, and resilience. Together, they forged a kingdom that was richer, stronger, and more enduring than either might have been alone. The story of the Anglo-Saxons did not end in 1066, lived on in every Englishman and woman who carried both Saxon blood and Norman crown, in every word of the English tongue, in every custom of law and faith. Out of conquest arose not silence, but synthesis, and in that synthesis was born the England that would one day shape the world. Chapter 11. Kings and Barons, the Seeds of Rebellion. When the Norman kings had carved their rule into the very bones of England, when castles stood like stone fists upon the hills, when the memory of Hastings was still whispered with bitterness, yet tempered by the passage of generations, a new struggle began to stir within the kingdom, not between Saxon and Norman, for by now those two had already begun to merge into one people, but between king and barons, crown and nobility, power centralized and power dispersed. And it was this struggle, born from the seeds planted in the aftermath of conquest, that would shape the next centuries of English history. William the Conqueror had been a man of iron discipline, a ruler who brooked no opposition, who knew every acre of his realm and had it recorded in the Doomsday Book, that great ledger of land and obligation. His authority was near absolute, and his barons, though powerful, feared the strength of his hand. Yet, even in his reign the question lingered: how much freedom should the lords of England possess? How much power could the king demand, and how far would noble pride bend before royal will? It was a question that would smolder for decades, erupt in rebellion, and in time force kings to kneel before their own subjects, reshaping monarchy into something uniquely English. The earliest signs of tension lay in the very nature of feudalism. William had divided the land of England among his followers, rewarding Norman knights and lords with vast estates carved from dispossessed Saxon nobles. These men owed him loyalty and military service, yet they also gained tremendous power over their territories, building castles, enforcing justice, commanding armies of their own. In Normandy, the Duke had long struggled with barons who acted nearly as independent rulers. In England, William sought to prevent the same. He carefully avoided granting too much land in one area to any single lord, scattering their holdings so that no man could easily gather enough strength to rival the crown. Yet even with these precautions, the barons resented their dependence, hungered for greater independence, and plotted to assert their rights whenever royal power wavered. This simmering discontent flared after William's death in 1087, when his realm was divided between his sons. Robert received Normandy, William Rufus took England, and thus the kingdom was split, its unity fractured. Many barons, holding lands on both sides of the Channel, found themselves torn in loyalty. Should they serve Robert in Normandy or William in England? This conflict of allegiance created fertile ground for rebellion. Some lords attempted to play one brother against the other, bargaining for privileges, while others openly defied the king, raising arms in the hope of securing concessions. William Rufus, though cunning and ruthless, faced constant threats from nobles who saw in him a chance to weaken the crown. His reign was marked by suspicion and unrest, and his sudden death in 1100 struck by an arrow in the New Forest. Whether by accident or assassination, none could say opened the way for his brother Henry to seize the throne. Henry I, known as Beauclerc for his learning, sought to restore order and legitimacy by binding himself not only to the Norman nobility, but also to the Saxon people. He married Matilda, daughter of the old Saxon royal line, thus uniting the blood of conquerors and conquered in the royal household. Yet even Henry's wisdom could not silence the ambitions of barons, for each generation of lords grew bolder, more determined to assert their own privileges. Henry kept them in check through relentless energy, traveling across his realm, enforcing law, demanding taxes, and holding justice in his own name. But when he died in 1135, without a legitimate son, the fragile balance shattered, plunging England into a period of chaos, remembered as the Anarchy. The Anarchy was a bitter civil war between Henry's daughter, Empress Matilda, and her cousin, Stephen of Blois, who seized the throne upon Henry's death. For nearly 2 decades, England was torn apart by shifting allegiances, battles, and betrayals, a land where the authority of the crown was weakened, and the power of barons grew unchecked. Chroniclers of the time spoke with despair of lords who built unauthorized castles, who turned the countryside into a patchwork of petty wars, who oppressed the people with mercenary armies. Christ and his saints slept, wrote the Anglo Saxon chronicle, capturing the misery of a kingdom where law dissolved and violence reigned. In this crucible of suffering, the barons tasted the intoxicating freedom of near sovereignty, ruling their lands with impunity, and it was a taste they would not forget. Order was restored when Matilda's son, Henry Plantagenet, rose to power, becoming Henry II in 1154. With him began the great Plantagenet dynasty, a line of kings who would rule for centuries, their ambitions stretching beyond England to France and the wider world. Henry II was perhaps the most formidable monarch since William himself, a man of restless energy, keen intellect, and iron will. He sought to curb the excesses of the barons, to bring them once more under the discipline of the crown. He reformed justice, establishing royal courts that reached into every corner of the land, reducing the arbitrary power of local lords. His reign marked the strengthening of common law, that uniquely English system born of Saxon roots and Norman order. Yet, even as he bound the barons in law, Henry faced bitter struggles with the church in his conflict with Thomas Becket, with his own family in rebellions, led by his sons, and always with the nobility, whose pride and wealth made them dangerous adversaries. It was Henry's son, Richard the Lionheart, who embodied the chivalric ideal of the age, more crusader than king, absent from England for much of his reign as he fought in the Holy Land. In his absence, the burden of rule fell upon his brother John, a man of cunning but little charisma, whose reign would ignite the greatest confrontation yet between king and barons. John inherited a realm stretched thin, burdened with debts from Richard's crusades, threatened by the ambitions of France. To sustain his wars, he demanded heavy taxes, extorted wealth, and ruled with suspicion and cruelty. The barons, weary of endless demands, furious at arbitrary justice, and emboldened by their memories of power during the anarchy, rose against him. Their rebellion culminated in 1215 with the sealing of the Magna Carta, that great charter of liberties forced upon the king at Runnymede. The Magna Carta was not, at first, a declaration of freedom for all men, but a bargain between king and barons, a demand that royal authority be bound by law, that no free man be imprisoned without judgment, that taxation require consent. Yet though narrow in scope, its symbolism was immense, for it marked the first time in English history that a king had been compelled to recognize limits upon his power, the first time that the seeds of constitutional rule were sown. The barons, descendants of Norman conquerors, had turned against the very monarchy their forefathers had upheld, and in doing so they forged a precedent that would echo through the centuries, inspiring struggles for rights and liberties long after their own age had passed. Thus the story of the Anglo-Saxon legacy did not end in conquest, nor in blending, but in this ongoing struggle between rulers and ruled, between the crown that sought to dominate and the nobles who sought to resist. Out of their conflicts arose not only chaos and war, but also law, precedent, and the foundations of a political culture that valued negotiation, balance, and the recognition that even kings must answer to others. The Saxons had once gathered in their moots to decide matters of law. The Normans had imposed the might of feudal order, and now their descendants together forged a new path, one in which neither king nor baron would hold absolute sway, but where the kingdom itself became something larger than any one man's will. And yet, even as the Magna Carta was sealed, its promises fragile and its enforcement uncertain. One question loomed above all. Had the barons truly secured freedom, or had they merely shifted power from one tyrant to many? The answer would only be revealed in the struggles yet to come, as kings sought to reclaim what they had lost, and the people of England learned to wield the legacy of both Saxon endurance and Norman pride in their own pursuit of destiny. Chapter 12. The Rise of Parliament, from Barons to Commons. When King John sealed the Magna Carta at Runnymede in 1215, the great meadow by the River Thames was heavy with the scent of summer and the tension of rebellion. The king's banner drooped in the still air. The barons' armed men stood restless upon the grass, and no one present could have known that this fragile agreement, born of distrust and hostility, would echo across centuries to shape the very essence of English government. At the time, Magna Carta was a truce, a desperate bargain between a hated king and his powerful subjects. John had no intention of keeping its promises, and the barons had no illusions that they could simply lay down their arms and return to peace. Yet within its clauses, within the ink pressed into parchment by royal hand, lay the seeds of something greater, the principle that law was above the king, that rule must be shared, that authority must be held accountable. It was the beginning of a struggle that would give rise to Parliament. But the birth of Parliament was not sudden, nor inevitable. It grew out of centuries of Saxon tradition, Norman discipline, and baronial resistance. Shaped by conflict, necessity, and ambition, the Anglo Saxons had long gathered in their witten councils of nobles and clergy who advised kings, and in their moots, where freemen debated local matters. The Normans had centralized power, imposing order through feudal hierarchy. Now, in the wake of Magna Carta, these traditions began to intertwine, forming something new, a body that would stand between king and kingdom, representing not only lords, but eventually knights, townsmen, and common folk. The road to this transformation was long and bitter, paved with rebellion, war, and compromise. And it began in the turbulent years after John's death. John's reign ended in turmoil. In 1216, weakened and despised, he died of illness while fleeing rebels, leaving the throne to his 9-year-old son, Henry III. The kingdom was in chaos, with French forces invited by rebel barons pressing claims to the throne. Yet the regency that governed for the boy king moved quickly, reissuing Magna Carta as a gesture of good faith, stripping away some of its harsher clauses but affirming its spirit. This clever move drew support back to the crown, helped to drive out the French, and restored a semblance of order. The charter thus survived, not as a relic of failed rebellion, but as a living document, renewed and reaffirmed, becoming a touchstone for every generation of Englishmen who sought to hold their rulers to account. Henry III, once grown, proved less wise than his advisors had hoped. He reigned for decades, from 1216 to 1272, a reign that should have brought stability, but instead deepened tensions. He was pious, extravagant, and often careless in matters of finance and politics. He rebuilt Westminster Abbey in magnificent Gothic style, a monument to his devotion. But he squandered vast sums on foreign adventures, on costly wars in France, and on supporting his relatives from the French house of Poitiers, who flocked to England seeking power and wealth. The barons, who bore the burden of taxation and saw foreigners enrich themselves at their expense, grew restless. They remembered Magna Carta, remembered their father's defiance, and began once more to demand limits upon the crown. The great clash came under the leadership of Simon de Montfort, a French-born noble who had married the king's sister and become one of England's most powerful lords. At first loyal, Simon grew disillusioned with Henry's misrule, his extravagance, and his favoritism. When Henry sought more taxes for his failed campaigns, the barons resisted. In 1258, they forced the king to accept the provisions of Oxford, a radical reform that placed governance in the hands of a council of barons, effectively reducing the king to a figurehead. For the first time, England saw the crown compelled to share authority in a structured way. It was a fragile arrangement, born of anger and necessity, and it quickly unraveled as factions split and mistrust grew. The struggle turned to civil war, remembered as the Second Barons' War, at Lewes in 1264. Simon de Montfort's forces defeated the king, capturing Henry and his son, Prince Edward. For a brief, astonishing moment, de Montfort ruled England in the king's name, and in 1265 he summoned a council unlike any before. To his assembly, he called not only barons and bishops, but also 2 knights from each county and representatives from the boroughs, the towns and cities whose merchants and tradesmen were rising in wealth and influence. This gathering, though temporary, was revolutionary. It marked the first true parliament, a body that included not only the great lords of the realm, but men who spoke for the shires and towns, men who represented the broader kingdom. For the first time, the voices of England's commons echoed in the halls of power. Though de Montfort's experiment was short-lived, he was defeated and killed at the Battle of Evesham in 1265. Its legacy endured. Prince Edward, who later became Edward I, had seen firsthand the danger of unchecked baronial power and the necessity of broader representation. When he took the throne in 1272, he built upon the precedent, summoning what became known as the Model Parliament in 1295. It was Edward who gave lasting form to de Montfort's vision, calling together lords, bishops, knights, and burgesses, establishing a structure that would endure for centuries. Parliament was still no democracy. It was a gathering of the powerful, the wealthy, the influential. Yet it was a step toward something new, something that made England different from the absolute monarchies of Europe. The idea that taxation required consent, that grievances must be heard, that laws must be debated in council, became ingrained in English political culture. The barons had won concessions, but in doing so, they had opened the door for the commons, and once opened, that door would never close. The rise of Parliament did not end the struggle between king and subjects. It merely gave it new form. Edward I himself was a formidable ruler, a conqueror of Wales, a hammer of the Scots. a man who sought to extend his dominion across the British Isles. He used Parliament to legitimize his wars, to raise funds, to rally the realm. Yet he also respected its necessity, recognizing that even a king as powerful as he could not rule without support. His successors would not always be so wise. In the 14th century, under Edward II and Edward III, Parliament's role grew stronger. Edward II's weakness and favoritism led to his deposition, orchestrated by barons and confirmed by parliamentary consent. Edward III, though more capable, relied heavily on Parliament to fund his wars against France, particularly the long and costly 100 Years' War. In granting funds, Parliament demanded rights: the right to approve taxation, the right to petition grievances, the right to shape law. Slowly, steadily, the institution evolved from a council of the powerful into a representative body, divided into two houses, the Lords and the Commons, each with its own voice. For the common people, life remained harsh. They toiled in fields, fought in wars, endured famine and plague. Yet through Parliament, their towns and counties gained a voice, however limited, in the governance of the kingdom. It was a small voice at first, often drowned out by the clamor of lords and bishops, but it grew with time. The commons learned to bargain, to insist upon redress before granting taxes, to assert themselves as guardians of the people's interests. By the late Middle Ages, Parliament had become not merely a tool of kings or nobles, but a counterweight to both, an institution that bound the destiny of England to more than a single ruler's will. The rise of Parliament was not a straight road, nor was it free of blood and betrayal. It was forged in rebellion, in war, in the ambitions of barons, and the pragmatism of kings. It emerged not from lofty ideals, but from necessity, from the grinding reality of power and the need to balance it. Yet, in its survival, in its growth, it carried forward the legacy of the Anglo Saxons, who had once gathered in their moots, of the Normans who had enforced feudal order, of the barons who had defied kings at Runnymede, and of men like Simon de Montfort who dared to summon knights and burgesses into the councils of the realm. And so, by the dawn of the 14th century, England stood apart, while in France, Spain, and much of Europe, kings ruled with near absolute authority. In England, the crown shared power, begrudgingly at times, but shared nonetheless. It was a fragile balance, one that would be tested again and again in centuries to come. But it was real. The seeds planted at Runnymede had grown into a sturdy tree, its branches stretching toward a future none of those barons, nor John himself, could have foreseen. Yet shadows still gathered. For all its promise, Parliament was not yet the voice of the people in full. It was a tool of nobles and monarchs alike, wielded in struggle, not yet in harmony. Beneath its growth, discontent simmered among the common folk, who bore the brunt of war and taxation. Their day would come, their voices would rise, but not yet. For now, the stage was set, the players assembled, and the next act of England's dark and mysterious history was about to unfold. Chapter 13. The 100 Years. War, fire, and iron across two kingdoms. The 14th century dawned with England restless, ambitious, and eager for glory. The kings of England had long held lands in France, remnants of the Norman conquest and the tangled web of dynastic marriages. These territories, Aquitaine, Gascony, and others, were both a blessing and a curse. Sources of wealth and trade, but also points of endless friction with the French crown. For 2 centuries, English kings had bowed, however reluctantly, to the King of France as their feudal overlord for these lands. It was a humiliation, a thorn in the pride of a realm that saw itself as equal to any power in Christendom. By the reign of Edward III, that thorn had festered into open war, a war that would last more than a century, tearing two kingdoms apart, drenching fields in blood, and forging legends that would endure for all time. This was the 100 Years' War. The spark came in 1328, when the French King Charles IV died without a direct male heir. By the laws of succession in France, the crown should have passed to the nearest male relative. But who was that? Through his mother, Isabella, daughter of King Philip IV of France, Edward III of England had a claim, though it was through the female line. The French nobles, unwilling to see their throne fall to a foreign monarch, invoked the Salic law, excluding inheritance through women, and awarded the crown to Philip VI, a cousin of Charles. Edward, young, ambitious, and proud, initially paid homage for his French lands. But resentment smoldered, and when disputes flared over Gascony, he made his bold move. In 1337, Edward declared himself rightful king of France. Thus began the war that would consume generations. The early campaigns were marked by fire and devastation. The English, unable to match France's vast armies, man for man, turned to new tactics. They unleashed the Chevauqué raids of burning and pillaging across the French countryside, designed not only to weaken the enemy, but to terrorize the land into submission. Villages went up in flames, fields were trampled under horses' hooves, and peasants fled in terror as the English swept through. It was war as spectacle and terror, a new kind of ruthlessness that struck at the very heart of France. But the true strength of the English lay not in fire alone, but in the longbow. This weapon, simple in form, yet deadly in power, became the symbol of English might. 6 feet of yew wood, drawn by arms hardened from childhood practice, could send arrows piercing through armor at astonishing range. At Crécy, in 1346, Edward III's army, though outnumbered, stood firm behind their archers. Wave after wave of French knights, clad in gleaming mail and mounted on proud destriers, charged forward, and wave after wave fell, brought down by clouds of arrows that darkened the sky. Their pride shattered by the sting of English shafts, the flower of French chivalry lay broken upon the field, their noble banners trampled into the mud. Crécy was not only a battle won, but a lesson taught. The age of the armored knight was giving way to the age of disciplined infantry and devastating archery in the aftermath. Edward marched north to Calais, laying siege to the port that guarded the channel. For a year the city endured, until hunger forced surrender. The story of Calais became legend. 6 burghers, gaunt and barefoot, offered themselves with ropes around their necks to Edward's mercy, prepared to die for their people. Only the pleas of Queen Philippa spared them, and Calais became an English stronghold for 2 centuries, a foothold in France that symbolized English ambition. The war, however, was not continuous. It ebbed and flowed with truces, plagues, and shifting fortunes. In 1348, the Black Death swept across Europe, carrying death on the wind. England and France alike were ravaged. Whole villages vanished. Fields went untilled, and armies crumbled as men fled or perished. For a time, war seemed meaningless in the face of such horror. Yet as the plague subsided, ambition returned, and with it the clash of arms. Edward's son, the famed Black Prince, carried the war into France with daring raids. In 1356, at Poitiers, he repeated his father's triumph, capturing King John II of France himself in battle. The French king was taken to London in chains, and France seemed on the brink of collapse. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 granted England vast lands, acknowledging Edward's rights in Aquitaine and renouncing his claim to the French throne. For a moment, it seemed England had won, but France was not so easily subdued. Though humiliated, it endured, finding strength in resilience. Under King Charles V and his brilliant General Bertrand du Guesclin, the French recovered much of their territory, avoiding pitched battles and harassing the English with guerrilla tactics. The tide turned once more, and England found its conquests slipping away. By the end of the 14th century, the great victories of Edward and the Black Prince seemed distant memories, their gains eroded by time, disease, and French determination. The war entered a new phase under Henry V, who took the throne in 1413. Young, ambitious, and fiercely capable, Henry sought to revive the glories of Crécy and Poitiers. In 1415, he crossed the Channel with a small army, aiming for conquest. Disease and exhaustion weakened his men, yet at Agincourt he faced a French force far larger than his own. The field was narrow, the ground muddy, the French eager to crush him, but once again, the English longbow proved decisive. The knights charged and were mired in mud, their armor weighing them down as arrows rained upon them. The slaughter was terrible, the pride of French nobility destroyed in a single day. Agincourt entered legend, Henry hailed as a warrior king of almost mythical stature. His triumphs continued. By the Treaty of Troyes, in 1420, Henry was recognized as heir to the French throne, marrying Catherine, daughter of the French king. It seemed the crowns of England and France would be united at last. Yet fate was cruel. Henry died suddenly in 1422, leaving his infant son Henry VI as king of both realms. The dream of conquest slipped once more into uncertainty. In the years that followed, France rallied around an unlikely figure, Joan of Arc, a peasant girl from Domremy, who claimed visions from God. Clad in armor, bearing a banner, she inspired soldiers and rekindled hope. At Orleans, in 1429, her leadership lifted the siege, and the French began to push back, captured and burned as a heretic by the English in 1431. Joan's death only strengthened her legend, turning her into a symbol of French unity and divine favor. The tide had turned, and England's grip began to weaken. By 1453, the 100 Years' War came to its weary end. England held only Calais, all other conquests lost. France, battered but unbowed, emerged stronger, more united under its kings. England, drained of wealth and spirit, turned inward, its nobles restless, its crown weakened. The long war that had begun with dreams of empire ended in failure, leaving scars that would never heal. Yet the war had changed both kingdoms forever. In France, it strengthened royal authority, fostering unity against a common foe. In England, it gave Parliament greater leverage, for kings could not fight without funds, and funds required consent. The longbow had shattered the knightly order, heralding new forms of warfare. The people themselves, once pawns in noble quarrels, had borne the weight of war and plague, shaping a new awareness of their role in the realm. The 100 Years' War was more than battles and treaties. It was a crucible of identity. It forged in the English a sense of nationhood, pride in their archers, their kings, their defiance against odds. It forged in the French a determination to resist, to endure, to reclaim their land. Out of its fire and iron rose legends Edward III and the Black Prince, Henry V and Agincourt, Joan of Arc and Orleans, legends that even now echo in memory, haunting the fields where blood once ran like rivers. And when the war was over, when the banners were lowered and the dead left behind, England turned upon itself. The very nobles who had fought in France, hardened by battle, ambitious for power, now set their eyes upon the throne of their own kingdom. The next chapter of England's dark history was about to begin. A war not of nations, but of families, not across the Channel, but upon the very soil of the realm. The Wars of the Roses were coming. Chapter 14. The Wars of the Roses, a kingdom torn in two, the dust of the 100 Years. War had barely settled when England turned its fury inward. The long struggle against France had drained its coffers, crippled its armies, and shattered its spirit. The great victories of Crécy and Agincourt were little more than fading echoes, drowned beneath the bitter taste of final defeat. The nobility, hardened by years of conflict and ambitious for power, began to circle like wolves around a wounded crown. At the heart of the kingdom sat a frail and troubled monarch, Henry VI, son of the great Henry V, but a king utterly unsuited to the brutal demands of rule. Pious, Gentle, and prone to bouts of mental collapse, Henry lacked the iron will his realm desperately needed. Into this vacuum of authority crept ambition, intrigue, and treachery. England was about to descend into a storm of civil war that would rage for decades. A struggle not between nations, but between families, fought beneath the banners of two roses, white for York, red for Lancaster. This was the Wars of the Roses, a conflict that would drench the soil of England in the blood of its own sons. The seeds of this war were sown in the weakness of Henry VI. Unlike his warrior father, Henry sought peace and prayer, retreating into cloisters while his kingdom unraveled. His marriage to Margaret of Anjou, a fierce and determined French princess, might have provided strength, but instead it deepened divisions. Margaret, ambitious and unyielding, sought to control the court, surrounding herself with allies despised by the nobility. The loss of France only heightened discontent. Nobles who had bled and sacrificed for decades returned home embittered, stripped of their lands abroad, demanding recompense. In this atmosphere of disillusion, one man rose as a rival claimant, Richard, Duke of York. Richard of York was no ordinary noble. He was of royal blood, descended from Edward III through both his father and mother, and his claim to the throne was arguably stronger than Henry VI's. Charismatic, shrewd, and ambitious, he saw the chaos of Henry's reign as an opportunity. At first, he positioned himself as a loyal servant, demanding reform of the corrupt court. But beneath the veneer of loyalty burned the fire of ambition. When Henry fell into a catatonic stupor in 1453, York was appointed protector of the realm, effectively ruling in the king's stead. For a time, it seemed power had shifted decisively, but when Henry recovered, Margaret maneuvered to have York dismissed, setting the stage for confrontation. The first clash came at St. Albans in 1455. York's forces, bearing the White Rose, met the Lancastrian army loyal to Henry and Margaret. The streets of the town became a battlefield, echoing with the clash of swords and the cries of the dying. When the fighting ended, York was victorious, and several Lancastrian nobles lay dead. The Wars of the Roses had begun. For the next 30 years, England became a kingdom of shifting loyalties and endless betrayal. Families were torn apart as fathers fought sons, brothers fought brothers, and neighbors chose sides in a conflict that seemed without end. The battles were brutal, but they were also deeply personal. This was not war fought in foreign fields but upon England's very soil. Fields of wheat became fields of death, rivers ran red with blood, and towns awoke to find themselves occupied by one side or the other. Their allegiance tested by steel. Richard of York's ambitions, however, would not see him crowned. In 1460, at the Battle of Wakefield, he was slain, his head impaled upon the gates of York with a paper crown placed mockingly upon it. His death might have ended his cause, but instead it passed the torch to his son, Edward. Young, handsome, and brilliant in battle, Edward of York seized the moment. At Totan, in 1461, he led his army against the Lancastrians in one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil. Snow fell thick upon the ground, and the fighting raged for hours. By the day's end, as many as 28,000 men lay dead, their bodies littering the fields. It was a massacre, a slaughter that burned itself into memory. Edward emerged victorious, and with his triumph, he was crowned Edward IV, King of England. Edward's reign, however, was anything but secure. Though he had seized the crown, the Lancastrians remained defiant, Margaret of Anjou relentless in her resistance. Again and again she rallied forces, striking back with fury, yet each time she was beaten down. Captured in battle, Henry VI was imprisoned in the Tower of London, while his queen fled into exile. For a time, Edward seemed unassailable, ruling with confidence and charm. But ambition is a dangerous companion, and betrayal lurked in his own camp. Chief among Edward's allies had been Richard Neville. Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker. A towering figure of wealth and power, Warwick had helped place Edward upon the throne. Yet when Edward defied him, choosing his own bride, Elizabeth Woodville, over Warwick's political match, the alliance fractured, resentment festered, and Warwick, once Edward's greatest supporter, became his deadliest foe. In a stunning reversal, he allied with Margaret of Anjou and restored Henry VI to the throne in 1470. For a brief moment, the Lancastrians triumphed. Their mad king returned to power, but Edward was not finished. Fleeing into exile, he gathered support and returned in 1471, striking with the ferocity of a lion. At Barnet, he clashed with Warwick in a battle shrouded by fog. Confusion reigned, friends mistaking friends for foes, and Warwick himself was slain upon the field. Soon after, at Tewkesbury, Edward crushed Margaret's forces, capturing and killing her son, the Lancastrian Prince of Wales. With their heir dead and their champion gone, the Lancastrian cause collapsed. Henry VI was murdered in the Tower, his line extinguished. Edward IV reigned supreme, York triumphant, yet peace was fleeting. Edward's death in 1483 left the throne to his young son, Edward V, a boy of 12. Too young to rule, he fell under the guardianship of his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard, ruthless and ambitious, wasted little time. Seizing the boy and his younger brother, he lodged them in the Tower of London. Soon after, both vanished from sight, their fate cloaked in mystery. Whispers spread that Richard had murdered his nephews, and in their place he seized the crown. Becoming Richard III, the shadow of infanticide darkened his reign, and though Richard was a capable soldier, his legitimacy was forever tainted. The final act of this bloody drama came in 1485, upon the fields of Bosworth. There, Richard faced the forces of Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian claimant who had spent years in exile. The battle was fierce, but betrayal sealed Richard's fate. As allies defected to Henry's side, Richard charged into the fray, determined to kill his rival with his own hand. Surrounded and struck down, he fell crying, "A horse! A horse! My kingdom for a horse!" His body was hacked and displayed, his crown placed upon the head of Henry Tudor. With that, the Wars of the Roses ended. Henry Tudor was crowned Henry VII, uniting the warring houses by marrying Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV. Red rose and white rose were fused into the Tudor rose, symbol of reconciliation. Yet beneath the veneer of unity, the scars remained. The nobility had been decimated, families destroyed, and the memory of betrayal lingered in every shire. England had paid a terrible price for its dynastic struggles, a kingdom torn apart by ambition and pride. The Wars of the Roses were not simply battles for a crown. They were battles for the very soul of England. In them we see the end of medieval chivalry, the death of feudal power, and the birth of a stronger monarchy. They forged legends. Richard III, reviled as a villain. Warwick the Kingmaker, whose ambition outstripped his loyalty. Edward IV, the brilliant warrior king. Margaret of Anjou, fierce and unyielding. And in their ashes rose the Tudors, who would transform England into a Renaissance power. But for all its resolution, the tale remains one of darkness. Brothers betrayed brothers, kings murdered nephews, queens lost sons, and towns bled for causes not their own. The roses may have united in the Tudor emblem, but their thorns left deep wounds. And as the last echoes of Bosworth faded, England stood on the threshold of a new age. The medieval world had ended, and a new dawn was rising. Yet the shadow of blood and betrayal would linger, a reminder that power is never given freely, only taken by force, and that history is written not only by the victors, but by the silence of the graves they leave behind. Chapter 15. The Rise of the Tudors, a New Dynasty of Power. The fields of Bosworth still reeked of blood when the crown of England passed from one dynasty to another. In that single battle, fought on August 22nd, 1485, the long and bitter Wars of the Roses came crashing to an end. Richard III, the last of the Plantagenet kings, lay dead in the mud, his battered body stripped and mocked, his crown seized and placed upon the head of a man who, only months earlier, had been a fugitive in exile. That man was Henry Tudor, soon to be crowned Henry VII. To many, he seemed an unlikely monarch, a claimant of distant descent. His path to power paved more by fortune and betrayal than by destiny. Yet his victory marked the beginning of one of the most consequential dynasties in English history, a dynasty that would transform the kingdom, redefine monarchy, and leave behind a legacy of both glory and blood. The Tudors had arrived, and England would never be the same. Henry Tudor's claim to the throne was tenuous at best. Through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, he traced his lineage to John of Gaunt, a son of Edward III. But the Beaufort line was legally barred from succession. His father, Edmund Tudor, was half-brother to Henry VI through their mother, Catherine of Valois, widow of Henry V. It was a patchwork claim, fragile and easily contested. Yet in the chaos of civil war, legitimacy mattered less than power. Henry Tudor had defeated Richard III in open battle, and in the brutal logic of medieval kingship, victory was its own justification. Still, Henry knew his crown rested on shaky foundations. To secure it, he needed more than a battlefield triumph. He needed to unite the fractured kingdom and extinguish rival claims that might rise to challenge him. His first act was a masterstroke of symbolism. Henry declared that his reign had begun the day before Bosworth, making Richard's supporters traitors by definition. By doing so, he rewrote the narrative, painting himself as the rightful king whose crown had been usurped by Richard, rather than the other way around. Next, he moved to fulfill a promise that had underpinned his cause: marriage to Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV. This union symbolized the reconciliation of the two warring houses Lancaster and York. Their marriage blended the red rose of Lancaster with the white rose of York, creating the Tudor rose, a symbol of unity that would adorn England's banners for generations. In this single act, Henry turned a fragile claim into a dynastic legitimacy recognized by both sides of the conflict. Yet beneath this veneer of unity, dangers lurked. England was weary of war, but not free of ambition. Discontented nobles, survivors of decades of bloodshed, eyed the throne with suspicion and envy. Pretenders would rise, some with stronger claims than Henry himself. The first and most dangerous came in the form of Lambert Simnel, a boy of humble birth, who was manipulated by Yorkist loyalists to impersonate Edward, Earl of Warwick, a legitimate heir imprisoned in the Tower. Simnel was crowned in Dublin as King Edward VI, his cause backed by powerful supporters, including Margaret of Burgundy, sister of Edward IV. Henry faced the threat head-on at the Battle of Stoke Field in 1487. His forces clashed with the rebels in what many historians call the last battle of the Wars of the Roses. Henry triumphed, crushing the rebellion and capturing Simnel. Remarkably, he spared the boy, assigning him to work as a servant in the royal kitchens, a calculated display of mercy that contrasted with his ruthless treatment of the nobles who had supported the cause. But the shadows persisted. Soon after, a far more dangerous pretender emerged, Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be Richard of Shrewsbury, one of the princes in the Tower supposedly murdered by Richard III. Warbeck's story spread like wildfire across Europe, for many still doubted the fate of the princes, backed by foreign powers, including Scotland and Burgundy. Warbeck waged a campaign of disruption against Henry for nearly a decade. He launched invasions, stirred conspiracies, and threatened to unravel Henry's hard-won peace. Yet each time, Henry countered with patience and cunning. In 1497, Warbeck was captured. At first, Henry spared him, holding him as a prisoner. But when Warbeck attempted escape, Henry's mercy ended. The pretender was executed, his claim extinguished on the scaffold. Henry's reign was defined by this constant balancing act, ruthless in crushing threats, yet shrewd in cultivating stability. He understood that England, battered by civil war, needed not only strength, but order. Unlike the flamboyant kings who preceded him, Henry ruled with caution and calculation. He strengthened the monarchy's finances, restoring the crown's wealth through careful taxation and the use of fines. He curbed the power of overmighty nobles by limiting their ability to maintain private armies. He expanded royal justice, ensuring disputes were settled in courts loyal to the crown. His reign may not have been glorious in the romantic sense, but it was effective. By the time of his death in 1509, Henry VII had transformed the monarchy into a stronger, more centralized institution, laying the foundation for Tudor dominance. Yet for all his achievements, Henry's reign was not free of darkness. His rule was marked by paranoia, suspicion, and an iron grip on power. His network of spies and informers kept constant watch, his punishments swift and severe. Many nobles, who once dreamed of power, found themselves crushed beneath his cautious but relentless hand. England may have been at peace, but it was a peace maintained by fear. Henry's greatest legacy, however, was not his financial reforms or his victories over pretenders, but his son, the fiery, charismatic Henry VIII. When Henry VII died, his 17-year-old heir inherited not only the crown but also a kingdom stabilized and fortified by his father's cautious rule. In this young prince burned the energy and ambition of a monarch unlike any England had ever seen. Tall, athletic, and dazzling in charisma, Henry VIII seemed the embodiment of Renaissance kingship. He promised glory, splendor, and triumph, and for a time, he delivered. Yet beneath his brilliance lay a darker nature, one that would plunge England into upheaval and reshape the course of history. The Tudors had risen from the blood-soaked fields of Bosworth, but their story was only beginning. The dynasty that Henry VII forged in caution would, in the hands of his son, explode in passion, tyranny, and revolution. The White Rose and the Red had united, but what would happen when that union was tested by ambition, desire, and the lust for absolute power? The answer would come soon enough, and it would echo through the centuries. Chapter 16. Henry VIII, a king of splendor and shadows. When Henry VIII ascended the throne in 1509, the people of England rejoiced as though a golden age had dawned. Gone was the cautious, tight-fisted reign of his father, Henry VII, who had ruled with suspicion and restraint. In his place stood a young man of dazzling charisma, immense energy, and boundless ambition. At just 17, Henry radiated the confidence of youth. He was tall, over 6 feet, broad-shouldered, strong, and handsome, a striking figure whose athleticism matched his intellect. Trained in music, languages, hunting, and theology, he embodied the Renaissance ideal of the perfect prince. Where his father had hidden behind caution and secrecy, Henry VIII burst forth with pageantry and splendor. To his subjects, it seemed as if fortune had finally smiled upon them, granting England a monarch worthy of legend. Yet within this brilliance lay shadows and arrogance, a temper, and a will to dominate that would, in time, transform Henry from a beloved king into one of history's most infamous rulers. At the outset, Henry's reign was marked by joy and festivity. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand, and Isabella of Spain, and widow of his late brother, Arthur, sealed a powerful alliance between England and one of Europe's greatest kingdoms. Their union was celebrated as divinely ordained, a match that would secure England's place among Europe's great powers. Catherine herself was admired, pious, intelligent, and dignified. She seemed the perfect queen consort. Together, they projected the image of a harmonious royal couple, destined to bring stability and glory. Henry delighted in tournaments, feasts, and music. His court became a glittering center of culture, where scholars, poets, and musicians flourished. The king himself composed songs, played instruments, and even wrote theological treatises. He reveled in jousting, hunting, and displays of chivalry, embodying the romantic ideal of a warrior king. To many, he seemed the very model of kingship, a Renaissance prince whose brilliance reflected divine favor. But Henry was not content merely to enjoy splendor. He hungered for glory. War, he believed, was the true measure of kingship. Unlike his father, who had carefully avoided costly conflicts, Henry dreamed of martial triumphs that would rival those of Henry V at Agen. Early in his reign, he turned England's gaze toward France, launching campaigns to reclaim ancestral lands and assert his power on the continent. In 1513, at the Battle of the Spurs, Henry's forces achieved a symbolic, though modest victory, capturing towns and gaining prestige. Meanwhile, his allies won the Battle of Flodden against the Scots, killing King James IV and crushing Scotland's power for a generation. These triumphs, though limited, fed Henry's vanity and bolstered his reputation as a warrior king. Yet war was costly, and Henry's dreams often exceeded England's resources. Unlike France or Spain, England was a smaller kingdom with limited finances. Henry's wars drained the treasury, forcing him to rely on heavy taxation and unpopular levies. Still, he pressed on, driven by an insatiable desire for recognition on the European stage. He sought to position himself as a player among the great monarchs of the age, Francis I of France, Charles V of Spain, and the Pope in Rome. For a time, Henry succeeded. His court dazzled, his image shone, and his kingdom prospered under the appearance of strength. But beneath the glitter, cracks began to show. Catherine of Aragon, though a devoted queen, struggled to provide Henry with what he desired most, a male heir. Their first son, Prince Henry, died shortly after birth. Over the years, Catherine bore several children, but only one survived infancy, Princess Mary. Though Henry adored Mary, he grew increasingly desperate for a son, fearing that without a male heir, the Tudor dynasty, still young and fragile, would collapse into civil war. His anxiety deepened as he aged. By the mid-1520s, Catherine was beyond childbearing years. Henry's obsession with securing the succession consumed him, transforming a personal concern into a political and spiritual crisis. It was then that Anne Boleyn entered the stage. Unlike Catherine, Anne was not a foreign princess, but the daughter of an English courtier. She had spent time in France, where she absorbed the elegance and sophistication of the continental courts. Intelligent, witty, and ambitious, Anne was unlike any woman Henry had encountered. She refused to be his mistress, holding out for marriage. For Henry, her allure was irresistible, not only her beauty, but also her refusal to submit. She challenged him, inflamed his passion, and awakened his determination to set her upon the throne. But there was a problem. Henry was already married, and divorce was not easily granted. The Catholic Church, under Pope Clement VII, refused to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine. Catherine herself, proud and devout, would not consent to the dissolution. Henry's obsession grew into frustration, then fury. Convinced that his lack of a male heir was a punishment from God for marrying his brother's widow, he sought every argument, theological and legal, to justify his cause. He turned to his advisors, including Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, England's most powerful churchman, to secure the annulment. Wolsey failed, and his fall from grace marked the beginning of Henry's radical break with Rome. Henry was not a man to accept defeat. If the Pope would not grant his desire, then Henry would defy the Pope himself. This defiance gave rise to one of the most seismic transformations in English history, the English Reformation. Guided by Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell, Henry declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, severing ties with Rome. In doing so, he not only secured his divorce from Catherine, but also, unleashed a religious revolution that would tear the kingdom apart for generations. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 cemented his authority over the church, while monastery centers of wealth and influence were dissolved, their riches flowing into the crown's coffers, with Anne Boleyn at his side. Henry finally achieved his ambition, marriage to the woman who had captured his heart. In 1533, she was crowned queen, and later that year, she bore a daughter, Elizabeth. Henry was disappointed. It was not the son he craved, but he held on to hope. Yet Anne's fate would prove as tragic as it was dramatic. Accused of adultery, treason, and even incest, she was executed in 1536, her downfall orchestrated by Henry's own court. Elizabeth, though later destined to become one of England's greatest monarchs, was declared illegitimate. Henry's passions, once inflamed, had turned to bitterness and cruelty. The king who had once seemed the embodiment of Renaissance virtue now revealed his darker nature. His temper was legendary, his wrath terrifying. Those who opposed him met swift and brutal ends. Sir Thomas More, once his trusted advisor, was executed for refusing to acknowledge Henry as head of the church. Nobles, courtiers, and even wives fell victim to his suspicion and fury. His marriages became infamous, 6 in total, each a drama of love, ambition, betrayal, or tragedy. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. This grim rhyme would echo across centuries, capturing the peril of being bound to Henry VIII. Yet Henry's reign was not solely defined by tyranny. For all his flaws, he reshaped England in ways that endured long after his death. By breaking from Rome, he established the foundation of a national church independent of papal authority. By dissolving the monasteries, he redistributed immense wealth and land, altering the social and economic fabric of the kingdom. His reign strengthened royal authority, expanded the navy, and positioned England as a rising power. His daughter Elizabeth would one day inherit not only his crown but also the transformed nation he had forged. But Henry himself paid a heavy price. Once athletic and vigorous, he grew obese and diseased in later years, plagued by ulcers and a temper grown more violent with age. His paranoia deepened, his cruelty sharpened, and his court became a place of fear as much as splendor. By the time of his death, in 1547, Henry had secured his dynasty through brute force, leaving behind 3 children, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, each destined to shape England's future in their own way. Henry VIII remains one of the most contradictory figures in history, a king of brilliance and brutality, splendor and shadows. He embodied both the heights of Renaissance glory and the depths of tyranny. His reign dazzled with pageantry yet dripped with blood. To his subjects, he was at once the Golden Prince and the monstrous tyrant. To history, he is a figure impossible to ignore, larger than life, unforgettable, and forever controversial. Chapter 17. Edward VI, the Boy King, and the Protestant Experiment. When Henry VIII died in January of 1547, the weight of his turbulent legacy fell upon the slender shoulders of his 9-year-old son, Edward VI, a child whose life had been overshadowed by his father's obsessions and the bloody dramas of the Tudor court. Edward was the long-awaited male heir Henry had so desperately craved, the son born to Jane Seymour, Henry's 3rd wife, who had died tragically soon after childbirth. For the kingdom, Edward's accession was both a triumph and a risk. Triumph because the Tudor dynasty now had a legitimate male heir to secure its survival, but a risk because the new king was a mere boy, too young to rule in his own right, vulnerable to manipulation, and frail in health from the very beginning. The realm entered a new era, but it was an era defined less by Edward's will than by those who ruled in his name. The boy king was precocious, intelligent, and deeply pious. He had been raised in the Protestant faith, tutored by reformers and scholars who had instilled in him not only a knowledge of Latin, Greek, and theology, but also a strong devotion to the new doctrines sweeping across Europe. Unlike his father, who had broken from Rome largely for political and personal reasons, Edward was a true believer in Protestant reform. He studied scripture with fervor, admired the works of continental reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin, and saw himself as a godly prince tasked with purifying the English church. His diaries, written in a neat hand, reveal a boy unusually serious for his age, consumed with questions of faith and morality. Yet, however strong his convictions, Edward was still a child, and the machinery of power was seized by ambitious men determined to shape the kingdom in their own image. Upon Henry's death, the government of England was entrusted to a regency council, but almost immediately, one man rose to dominance: Edward Seymour, the boy's uncle and brother of Jane Seymour. Proclaimed Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector, Seymour wielded near absolute power under the guise of protecting his nephew. Initially popular, he promised reforms that would ease the burdens of the poor and advance the Protestant cause. Yet his rule was soon plagued by disorder and mismanagement. Somerset's government pursued an aggressive foreign policy, renewing war with Scotland in an attempt to secure a dynastic marriage between Edward and the infant Mary, Queen of Scots. The campaign culminated in the Battle of Pinkie in 1547, a bloody victory for England, but one that failed to achieve its goal. For the Scots quickly sent Mary to France, where she was betrothed to the French Dauphin. The war drained the treasury and stretched England's resources thin, leaving the country financially unstable. At the same time, social unrest boiled over. Economic hardship, caused by inflation, population growth, and the enclosure of common lands by wealthy landlords, sparked widespread discontent. The summer of 1549 saw the kingdom erupt in rebellion. In Norfolk, Robert Kett led thousands of peasants in protest against enclosures, demanding justice and reform. In Devon and Cornwall, a rebellion broke out against the new Protestant liturgy, as people resisted the replacement of the traditional Latin Mass with the English-language Book of Common Prayer. These uprisings shook the realm, revealing the fragility of Edward's government. Though both were brutally suppressed, Kett, hanged. Rebels massacred, their memory haunted the Protectorate. Meanwhile, in the corridors of power, Somerset's rivals conspired against him. Chief among them was John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, a ruthless and ambitious nobleman with a keen sense of political opportunity. In 1549, Dudley engineered Somerset's downfall, seizing control of the government. By 1551, Dudley had been elevated to Duke of Northumberland, becoming the real master of England, while Edward, though growing older, remained a figurehead. Yet Northumberland understood one crucial difference between himself and Somerset, where Somerset had ruled clumsily, alienating nobles and commoners alike. Northumberland cultivated alliances and managed the court with skill. Under his leadership, the government stabilized, and the Protestant cause advanced further than ever before. The heart of Edward's reign was the transformation of the English Church, with the young king's full support. Northumberland and Archbishop Thomas Cranmer pushed radical reforms that went far beyond Henry VIII's cautious break with Rome. The Book of Common Prayer, first issued in 1549 and revised in 1552, replaced the Latin liturgy with services in English, reshaping worship in every parish. Altars were removed, replaced with simple communion tables. Statues, relics, and images were destroyed in waves of iconoclasm, stripping churches of centuries of tradition. The doctrine of transubstantiation, the belief that bread and wine became the literal body and blood of Christ, was rejected, replaced with a symbolic interpretation of communion. Clerical celibacy was abolished, allowing priests to marry. For Edward, these reforms were not political conveniences, but sacred duties, the fulfillment of God's will to purify his church. In his eyes, he was a new Josiah, the biblical king who had restored true worship to Israel. Yet the speed and severity of reform alienated many. To devout Catholics, the destruction of the old religion was sacrilege. To moderate Protestants, the changes were destabilizing. But Edward was unyielding. He believed England was a chosen nation, tasked with leading the Protestant cause in Europe, and he longed to see further reform. Had his reign been longer, his vision, however, was clouded by his frail health. From early adolescence, Edward suffered recurring illnesses, likely tuberculosis. His once vigorous frame wasted away, his cough worsened, and by 1553 it became clear that the boy king was dying. His impending death created a political crisis. The Tudor dynasty, though strengthened by Henry VIII's force of will, remained precarious. Henry's will had decreed that, should Edward die without heirs, the crown would pass to his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth. But to Edward and his Protestant advisers, this was unthinkable. Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, was a devout Catholic who would certainly reverse the Reformation. Elizabeth, though raised Protestant, was considered illegitimate in the eyes of many, her birth tainted by the downfall of Anne Boleyn. Northumberland, desperate to preserve both Protestantism and his own power, devised a bold plan: bypass Henry VIII's will and place Lady Jane Grey, Edward's Protestant cousin, upon the throne. Lady Jane Grey was but 16, a scholarly and devout young woman with little desire for power. Yet she became the pawn of Northumberland's ambition and Edward's religious fervor. In his final months, Edward drafted a device for the succession, naming Jane as his heir. In July 1553, Edward VI died at the age of 15, his short life extinguished before he could see his vision fulfilled. The boy who had dreamed of a godly England, who had studied Scripture with the intensity of a prophet, left behind a kingdom deeply divided, reeling from reforms that had cut to the core of its identity. Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed queen, but her reign lasted only 9 days. The people, still loyal to the memory of Henry VIII and his bloodline, rallied to Mary Tudor. Northumberland was overthrown, Jane imprisoned in the Tower, and Mary entered London to jubilant crowds. Edward's Protestant revolution seemed destined to collapse under the weight of Catholic restoration. Yet his legacy endured, for the reforms he had championed could not be entirely undone. The English Church had been forever altered, its ties to Rome severed beyond repair. Edward VI remains an enigma in history, a boy too young to wield power fully, yet a king whose convictions reshaped his nation. To some, he was a tragic figure, a child manipulated by ruthless men. To others, he was a visionary reformer, a prince whose brief reign carried the seeds of England's Protestant destiny. He had been called the British Josiah, the king who tore down idols and restored true worship. Yet his reign ended in failure, his chosen successor deposed, his reforms nearly destroyed. And yet, from the ashes of his brief rule, a New England would rise, forged in the fires of religious conflict, destined for even greater turmoil under Mary and triumph under Elizabeth. Edward Vi's story is one of brilliance and fragility, faith and tragedy. He was the boy king whose reign lasted only 6 years, yet, in that fleeting time, he set England upon a course from which it would never fully turn back. His name may not inspire the same awe or dread as his father's, but his legacy, quiet and profound, lies at the heart of the English Reformation, as the young king drew his final breath in 1553. The stage was set for one of the darkest and most dramatic chapters in Tudor history, the reign of Mary I, the woman history would remember as Bloody Mary. Chapter 18. Mary I, the Bloody Queen. When Edward VI, the boy king, breathed his last, in July of 1553, the throne passed, not to the quiet and reluctant Lady Jane Grey, who had been thrust into power by political scheming, but to his half-sister, Mary Tudor, the eldest daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. For Mary, the moment was nothing short of miraculous. She had been declared illegitimate in her youth, cast aside when her mother was divorced, forced to submit to the indignity of recognizing Henry's second marriage to Anne Boleyn, and treated for decades as a pawn without influence. She had lived in the shadow of humiliation, watched the death of her mother in lonely exile, and endured the rise of Protestant reform under her brother. Yet now, against all odds, she was Queen of England, the first woman to rule the nation in her own right. It was a triumph for Mary, but one fraught with peril, for the kingdom she inherited was fractured, restless, and uncertain of what her reign would bring. The drama of Mary's accession began with treachery. Northumberland's attempt to install Lady Jane Grey as queen had failed spectacularly, though Jane was intelligent, virtuous, and devoutly Protestant. She lacked the bloodline that mattered most in the eyes of the people. Mary, the daughter of Henry VIII and granddaughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, carried the aura of legitimacy and dynastic continuity. As soon as Edward's death became known, the realm stirred. Mary, rallying support in East Anglia, sent out letters declaring her rightful claim. To the astonishment of Northumberland, the nobility and commons alike flocked to her banner. London erupted in celebration when she entered the capital in triumph, cheered as the true heir. Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days' Queen, was imprisoned in the Tower, her innocence overshadowed by the ambition of those around her. Northumberland was executed, and Mary began her reign with the weight of expectation heavy upon her shoulders. Mary Tudor was a woman of deep faith and iron will. To her, the turmoil of the preceding decades had not been a political matter but a spiritual crisis. Her father's break with Rome, her brother's Protestant reforms, the destruction of the Mass and the sacraments, these were not minor changes but grave heresies that threatened the salvation of souls. Mary saw herself as chosen by God to restore the true faith, to lead England back into the embrace of the Catholic Church. For her, religion was not a tool of power, but the very purpose of her reign. She believed with every fiber of her being that God had lifted her to the throne, to be his instrument of redemption. This conviction, though noble in its devotion, would shape her reign in ways that brought both tragedy and infamy. The first years of Mary's rule were marked by decisive action. Parliament repealed the Protestant laws enacted under Edward, restoring Catholic worship. Altars were rebuilt, images returned, the Latin Mass reinstated. Priests who had married were forced to abandon their wives or resign. Monasteries, though not fully restored, were spoken of with reverence once again. In 1554, Mary achieved her greatest religious victory, reconciliation with Rome. Cardinal Reginald Pole, her cousin and a staunch Catholic, arrived in England as papal legate, absolving the realm of its schism and bringing it back under the authority of the Pope. For Mary, this was a triumph not just of policy, but of divine providence. She had healed the wound inflicted by her father, restored the unity of Christendom, and secured what she believed was the path to England's salvation. Yet Mary's reforms met with resistance. For 2 decades, Protestant ideas had taken root, particularly in London and the southeast. Many had grown accustomed to hearing the Bible in English, to receiving communion in both kinds, 2 sermons that emphasized scripture over ritual. To these men and women, Mary's restoration of Catholicism was a step backward, a denial of what they saw as the truth of God's word. Some submitted reluctantly, others refused. Among the most defiant was Thomas Cranmer, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, who had crafted the Book of Common Prayer and guided Edward's religious reforms. Imprisoned and interrogated, Cranmer vacillated, even signing recantations at one point, but in the end he stood firm, declaring his Protestant faith before being burned alive at the stake in 1556. His execution, along with those of bishops, Latimer, and Ridley, became defining moments of Mary's reign. Latimer's famous words to Ridley, "We shall this day light such a candle, by God's grace," "In England as I trust shall never be put out," echoed through history as symbols of Protestant martyrdom. The burnings, which would earn Mary her enduring nickname, Bloody Mary, were the darkest chapter of her reign, between 1555 and 1558. Nearly 300 men and women were executed for heresy, their deaths recorded with harrowing detail by Protestant chroniclers such as John Foxe in his Book of Martyrs. These victims were not only clergy or learned scholars, but ordinary men and women, artisans, laborers, mothers, even teenagers, who refused to renounce their faith. The fires of Smithfield and Oxford blazed with their defiance, searing their memory into the national consciousness. To Mary, these executions were acts of justice, necessary purges of heresy, to save souls from eternal damnation. To her enemies, they were acts of cruelty, proof of her fanaticism. In time, the blood spilled during these years would overshadow all else, reducing her reign in popular memory to a nightmare of persecution. Religion was not Mary's only concern. Dynastic survival loomed large. At 37, she was unmarried and childless, yet she knew that the Tudor line depended on her producing an heir. Against the advice of many, she chose to wed Philip of Spain, son of Emperor Charles V and future King of Spain. The match was deeply unpopular in England, where memories of foreign domination and fears of Spanish influence stirred resentment. Wyatt's rebellion of 1554, led by Sir Thomas Wyatt, erupted in protest of the marriage, though the uprising was crushed and Wyatt executed. The event revealed the depth of unease in the kingdom. Nevertheless, the marriage went ahead. Philip arrived in England with pomp and ceremony, and in July 1554, he and Mary were wed. Mary was devoted to her husband, seeing in him not only a partner, but an ally in her religious mission. Philip, however, did not reciprocate her passion. He found his English wife unattractive, and her court provincial. His visits were infrequent, his affections distant. Mary, desperate for love and an heir, endured repeated disappointments. Twice she experienced what appeared to be pregnancies, her body swelling, her symptoms convincing, only for both to prove false. Each time, her hopes were shattered, her humiliation public. The queen, who longed to secure the Tudor line instead, found herself mocked by whispers of phantom pregnancies. Politically, the marriage drew England into European conflicts. In 1557, Mary declared war on France in support of Philip, dragging the kingdom into a struggle that drained resources and ended disastrously with the loss of Calais, England's last foothold on the continent. The fall of Calais in 1558 was a devastating blow, both strategically and symbolically. It marked the end of centuries of English territorial ambition in France, and for Mary it was a personal wound. "When I am dead and opened," she is said to have remarked, "you shall find Calais lying in my heart." By the final years of her reign, Mary was a queen beset by failures. Her marriage had brought her little joy, no child, and growing unpopularity. Her religious reforms, though initially successful, had failed to extinguish Protestant belief, and the fires of persecution had only hardened resistance. Her foreign policy had cost England its last continental possession. Her health, never strong, declined rapidly. By 1558, she was gravely ill, likely with cancer. On November 17th of that year, Mary Tudor died, her dreams unfulfilled, her legacy stained by the fires of Smithfield. She was 42 years old, yet her reign, though condemned by later generations, was not without significance. Mary restored the crown's authority, stabilized finances to some degree, and showed that a woman could rule England as sovereign in her own right. More profoundly, her reign revealed the deep divisions within the English people, divisions of faith and identity that would shape the nation for centuries. She believed she was saving England, guiding it back to the true path of Catholicism, but history remembered her instead as a tyrant, a symbol of religious fanaticism, her name forever linked with blood and fire. Mary was buried in Westminster Abbey, in the same tomb later shared by her half-sister Elizabeth. In death, the two queens, so different in faith and vision, so often opposed in life, lay side by side. The inscription honors only Elizabeth, not Mary, a silence that speaks volumes about how history chose to remember her. Yet perhaps there is a tragic grandeur in Mary's story. She was a woman of principle in an age of compromise, a queen who sacrificed popularity for conviction, a monarch who pursued her vision of truth, even at the cost of her legacy. But Mary's death did not end the drama of the Tudors, for now the crown passed to Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn. The child once dismissed as illegitimate, the sister Mary had distrusted and feared. With Elizabeth came not a return to Catholic unity, but the forging of a new Protestant identity, one that would define England's future. Where Mary had sought to heal by restoring the past, Elizabeth would seek to build by shaping the future. The stage was set for one of the most glorious and perilous reigns in English history. Chapter 19. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. When Mary Tudor closed her eyes for the final time in 1558, England stood at a crossroads, weary from decades of upheaval, religious strife, and dynastic uncertainty. Yet from this moment of despair there rose a new monarch whose reign would become legendary, shaping not only the destiny of her kingdom, but the course of world history. Elizabeth Tudor, the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, was 25 years old when she ascended the throne, and to many she was a figure both of hope and suspicion, for she carried the memory of her disgraced mother, executed on charges of treason and adultery, and the shadow of illegitimacy that had once cast her aside. But she also bore the dazzling promise of youth, intelligence, and charisma, qualities that England desperately needed after the somber years of Mary's reign. Elizabeth entered London in a golden procession, clad in brilliant robes, smiling to her people with theatrical grace, projecting not only majesty, but an intimacy that won hearts instantly. And in this first moment, she showed a truth that would define her reign. Elizabeth understood better than any monarch before her the power of image, the performance of sovereignty, and the need to be both queen and symbol for her nation. Elizabeth's England in 1558 was a fragile kingdom, poor in wealth compared to continental powers, scarred by religious division, and threatened by enemies abroad. Yet within this weakness lay opportunity, and Elizabeth seized it with remarkable skill. Her first and most urgent challenge was religion. The country had swung violently between Catholicism and Protestantism under her father, brother, and sister, leaving a people divided, anxious, and uncertain. But Elizabeth, pragmatic and shrewd, sought not to pursue vengeance, nor to impose extremes, but to craft a settlement that could hold the nation together. In 1559, she introduced the Elizabethan religious settlement, a compromise that established the monarch as supreme governor of the Church of England, restored Protestant doctrine through the Book of Common Prayer, yet retained certain elements of Catholic ritual to ease the transition. And while this did not satisfy radicals on either side, Puritans demanded further reform. Catholics longed for Rome. It provided a middle way that endured and became the foundation of English Protestant identity. In this, Elizabeth proved herself not a fanatic, but a stateswoman, steering the treacherous waters of belief with caution and vision. But religion was only one storm. Another swirled in the question of marriage and succession. As a young, unmarried woman, Elizabeth faced relentless pressure to wed, to produce an heir, to secure the dynasty. Yet, she resisted with remarkable defiance, turning suitors into pawns of diplomacy and transforming her single status into a weapon of power. She entertained proposals from kings and Princes Philip of Spain, Archduke Charles of Austria, Eric of Sweden, and even her own favorite, Robert Dudley, but she refused to surrender her independence, famously declaring herself married to England, Whether this decision was born of personal conviction, political necessity, or private trauma rooted in the fate of her mother, it became one of the defining features of her reign. For, by remaining the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth preserved her sovereignty from foreign control, avoided factional divisions at court, and cultivated a mystique that bound her to her people in a quasi-religious bond, as if she were the bride of the nation itself. Elizabeth's reign was not free of peril. Indeed, it was a continual dance with danger, a balancing act between survival and glory. From the outset, Catholic Europe regarded her as illegitimate and her rule as unlawful. The Pope excommunicated her in 1570, absolving her subjects of loyalty, and Catholic plots multiplied, seeking to replace her with her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, who, as a Catholic and descendant of Henry VII, was seen by many as the rightful Queen of England. Mary Stuart's presence became a thorn in Elizabeth's side, a living threat within the realm, and after years of intrigue, imprisonment, and conspiracies, the Northern Rebellion, the Ridolfi plot, the Throckmorton plot, the Babington plot, Elizabeth was finally forced, with heavy heart, to sanction her cousin's execution in 1587. The death of Mary, Queen of Scots, was both a triumph and a tragedy. It eliminated the greatest internal danger to Elizabeth's throne, but it also made her a regicide in the eyes of Europe, inflaming Spain and intensifying the looming conflict that would soon explode into open war. That conflict reached its zenith in 1588 with the most famous episode of Elizabeth's reign, the Spanish Armada. Philip II of Spain, outraged by Elizabeth's Protestant settlement, her execution of Mary Stuart, and her support for Dutch rebels fighting against Spanish rule, launched a massive fleet to invade England, a juggernaut of galleons and soldiers intended to crush Elizabeth and restore Catholicism. The Armada, vast and terrifying, sailed into the Channel, but England, under Elizabeth's leadership, responded with boldness. English ships, smaller and more maneuverable, harried the Spanish, using fire ships to scatter their formation, while storms and misfortune wreaked havoc on the enemy. At Tilbury, Elizabeth herself rode before her troops, clad in armor, declaring that she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, words that immortalized her as a warrior queen. The Armada was shattered, Spain humiliated, and Elizabeth's England triumphant. The victory was more than military. It was symbolic, cementing Elizabeth as the defender of her realm, the champion of Protestantism, and the figurehead of a new national identity, rooted in defiance, resilience, and pride. Yet Elizabeth's reign was not only about survival, it was also a time of cultural flowering and exploration, an age that posterity would call the Golden Age. Under her patronage and the relative stability she provided, literature, drama, and music flourished. This was the era of William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser, and countless others whose works defined the English Renaissance. On the seas, men like Francis Drake, Walter Raleigh, and Martin Frobisher embarked on daring voyages, challenging Spanish dominance, circumnavigating the globe, and planting the seeds of empire. In politics, Elizabeth mastered the art of governance, balancing her advisors, using her counsel wisely, and cultivating an image of majesty that commanded loyalty. She turned her court into a theater of power, where ritual, symbolism, and pageantry reinforced her authority, and where her very presence inspired awe. But even in her triumphs, shadows lingered. Elizabeth's refusal to marry left the question of succession unresolved, a source of constant anxiety. The wars in Ireland drained resources and revealed the limits of her power as rebellion flared repeatedly. Economic hardship and plague afflicted her people, and in her later years, the glow of her reign dimmed as favorites like Robert Dudley and Francis Walsingham died, leaving her increasingly isolated. By the end of the 1590s, she was aging, weary, her beauty faded, her once glittering court filled with tensions and ambitions. Yet she clung to the throne with remarkable resilience, embodying the continuity of the Tudor dynasty until her death. On March 24, 1603, after 45 years on the throne, Elizabeth I died at Richmond Palace. Her reign the longest of any Tudor, her legacy monumental. She left no heir, no child to carry forward her line, and with her death, the Tudor dynasty came to its end. But in dying childless, she had also secured something greater, the legend of the Virgin Queen. The image of a monarch who placed her people above all else, who turned her solitude into strength, who forged a nation's identity in the crucible of trial. Her successor would be James VI of Scotland, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland under the Stuart dynasty. But Elizabeth remained, in the hearts of her people, in the annals of history, Gloriana, the queen of an age that still bears her name. And yet, though Elizabeth's passing closed the book on the Tudors, it opened another story. For with James came not merely continuity, but transformation, the dawn of a new dynasty, new challenges, and new conflicts that would plunge England into wars of religion, power, and revolution. The Virgin Queen had secured the glory of her age, but what lay ahead for her kingdom was a struggle that would test whether the foundations she had built could endure the storms of the future. Chapter 20. James I and the Rise of the Stuarts. When Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, breathed her last in 1603, England mourned not only the passing of a monarch, but the end of an entire dynasty. For with her death the Tudors, who had ruled since Henry VII seized the crown at Bosworth in 1485, vanished from the stage of history, leaving behind a kingdom both proud of its golden age and anxious for its uncertain future. And into this vacuum stepped James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, a man whose blood tied him to both the Tudors and the ancient line of Scottish kings, and who now, by right of descent, became James I of England, the first Stuart to rule over a united realm of England and Scotland under what was called the Union of the Crowns. His arrival in England was marked not with resistance, but with celebration, for the nation, weary of uncertainty, welcomed stability, and many believed James, with his lineage, learning, and Protestant faith, would secure peace, continuity, and perhaps even a grand vision of unity that Elizabeth, in her solitary reign, had not achieved. But while James inherited Elizabeth's throne, he did not inherit her mystique, and where she had been theatrical, enigmatic, and commanding, James was pragmatic, verbose, and awkward, a man more at home with books and debate than with sword and ceremony. And though he styled himself as a peacemaker and unifier, his reign would soon reveal cracks, tensions, and conflicts that foreshadowed storms yet to come. James's background was itself a tapestry of tragedy and survival, for his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, had been executed on Elizabeth's orders after decades of imprisonment, and his father had been murdered when James was still an infant. From his earliest days, the boy king of Scotland lived in a court filled with conspiracies, kidnappings, and attempts to control him, shaping his wary, calculating character. By the time he came south to claim the English throne, he was already seasoned in the politics of survival. But England was not Scotland. It was richer, more centralized, and more sophisticated in its traditions of governance, and James entered with grand ambitions. He envisioned himself as the peacemaker of Christendom, a philosopher king who would end wars, reconcile enemies, and preside over a new era of stability, famously declaring that kings were like little gods on earth, anointed by divine right, accountable only to God, not to parliaments or people. To James, monarchy was not merely a political office, but a sacred institution, one that demanded obedience, reverence, and awe. Yet while this doctrine of the divine right of kings gave him confidence, it also sowed seeds of conflict with a parliament that had grown accustomed under the Tudors to asserting its influence, especially over matters of taxation and religion. One of James's first acts as king was to pursue peace, and in this he achieved notable success. In 1604, he signed the Treaty of London with Spain, ending the long and costly Anglo-Spanish War that had consumed Elizabeth's later years. And for the first time in decades, England enjoyed respite from continental conflict. James fancied himself the Rex Pacificus, the King of Peace, and indeed, his reign would be marked by avoidance of major wars, a stark contrast to the martial pomp of Elizabeth. But peace came at a price. While it spared his treasury and subjects from war, it also disappointed those who had grown rich and patriotic on privateering and warfare, and it deprived the kingdom of the rallying force of a common enemy. Moreover, James's attempts to act as mediator in Europe, to balance Catholic and Protestant powers, often made him appear indecisive, even weak, in the eyes of both his subjects and foreign courts. Religion, as always, remains the powder keg of early modern England, and here James faced challenges that revealed both his intelligence and his limitations. As a Protestant king, he was expected to uphold the Church of England, yet many Puritans hoped he would go further, stripping away what they saw as lingering popish elements in worship. While Catholics prayed, he might grant them toleration, perhaps remembering his Catholic mother. Early in his reign, James convened the Hampton Court Conference in 1604 to address religious grievances, and though he rejected Puritan demands for radical reform, he authorized a project that would become his most enduring legacy, the commissioning of a new English Bible, published in 1611. The King James Bible was a masterpiece of language and theology, a text whose rolling cadences and majestic style shaped not only English Christianity, but English literature and culture for centuries to come. Yet while this achievement earned him lasting fame, it did little to resolve the immediate tensions of faith in his kingdom. Catholics, increasingly marginalized, grew restless, and it was under James that one of the most notorious conspiracies in English history unfolded, the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. The plot, hatched by Robert Catesby, and involving the infamous Guy Fawkes, was a desperate plan to annihilate the king, Parliament, and Protestant leadership in a single, apocalyptic explosion beneath the House of Lords during the state opening. The conspirators smuggled barrels of gunpowder into the cellars, but the plot was betrayed at the last moment by an anonymous letter warning a nobleman to stay away, leading to Fawkes's capture on November 5, 1605. The discovery electrified England. The nation reeled at how close it had come to catastrophe, and the government responded with brutal executions and harsh penalties against Catholics. James emerged from the crisis with a halo of providence, hailed as the monarch saved by God's hand, yet the event deepened divisions, entrenching Protestant suspicion of Catholics and reinforcing the king's reliance on propaganda and pageantry to maintain loyalty. Even today, the annual celebration of Guy Fawkes Night, with its bonfires and effigies, echoes the fear and fervor of that moment, a testament to how the Gunpowder Plot seared itself into the memory of the nation, while James dreamed of peace and unity. His reign was also plagued by tensions with Parliament. His insistence on divine right clashed with the Commons' belief in their traditional privileges, especially the power of the purse. James needed money to support his court, his diplomacy, and his patronage, but Parliament was increasingly reluctant to grant subsidies without redress of grievances. To circumvent this, James resorted to dubious financial devices, impositions, monopolies, and the selling of titles, practices that enriched favorites but angered many. His court, too, became notorious for extravagance, corruption, and favoritism. The king's affection for handsome young men, most famously Robert Carr and later George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, raised eyebrows and scandals, fueling rumors of immorality and distracting from governance. Where Elizabeth's court had been a theater of majesty, James's often seemed a carnival of indulgence, and though he was personally learned, authoring works on kingship, witchcraft, and even tobacco, his inability to project regal mystique weakened his standing. Yet James was not without vision. He dreamed of uniting his two realms, England and Scotland, into one kingdom of Great Britain, with a single parliament, flag, and identity. He even adopted the title King of Great Britain and designed a new Union Jack to symbolize it. But Parliament resisted, fearing loss of English privilege and identity, and his ambition remained unfulfilled in his lifetime. Nonetheless, his reign laid the foundation for the idea of British unity, one that would resurface in later centuries. Abroad, he sought to secure dynastic alliances through marriage, most notably attempting to wed his son Charles to a Spanish princess in what became the controversial Spanish match. The negotiations dragged on for years, causing suspicion at home, and ultimately collapsed, humiliating both king and heir. As James aged, his health declined, and his authority waned, increasingly overshadowed by the rise of his favorite, Buckingham, whose influence in politics and patronage made him deeply resented. Meanwhile, the storm clouds of the 30 Years' War gathered in Europe, dragging James reluctantly into continental politics as his daughter Elizabeth and her husband, the Elector Palatine, became embroiled in the Protestant struggle against Catholic forces. James's inability to support them effectively tarnished his image as protector of Protestantism, and many saw him as weak, overly cautious, or simply ineffectual. By the time of his death in 1625, James I had ruled England for 22 years, presiding over a reign that was, in many ways, a paradox. He brought peace after decades of war, fostered cultural achievement through the King James Bible and patronage of the arts, and dreamed of unity. Yet his belief in divine right, his financial mismanagement, his court scandals, and his uneasy relationship with Parliament sowed seeds of discord that his son Charles would inherit and magnify. If Elizabeth's reign had been a golden stage where the Queen dazzled as Gloriana, James's reign was more like a dimly lit study, filled with ideas, quarrels, and uneasy compromises. A time when monarchy and Parliament began their slow collision course. And so, when James lay dying in March 1625, the nation stood again at a crossroads. But this time, the future seemed darker, more uncertain. For his heir Charles was young, proud, and far less inclined to compromise. A man who believed even more fiercely than his father in divine right, but who lacked his caution and pragmatism, and in this lay the seeds of tragedy. The Stuart experiment, begun with such hope in 1603, was about to spiral into a century of conflict, civil war, regicide, and revolution. The story of James I is not just about a king, it's about ambition, religion, and a dangerous game of power that set the stage for a century of turmoil. His reign lit the first sparks of conflict that would one day ignite into civil war. But this is only one chapter in the dark and mysterious history of the story. If you enjoyed this journey into the shadows of the past, don't forget to subscribe to Dark History and press the bell icon so you never miss the secrets, scandals, and mysteries still to come. Until next time, remember, the past is never truly buried. It waits for us in the dark.